My name is Owen Hartley. In the summer of 2019, I was working as a marine data technician aboard the RV Peregrine, a 68-meter oceanographic research vessel operated by the Atlantic Marine Sciences Institute out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'd been with the Peregrine for about 14 months. Before that, I spent 11 years as a data systems analyst for a property insurance company called Forsyth Risk Services, which you've probably never heard of because they were acquired in 2017 and the name disappeared. Most of us who worked there disappeared with it, more or less. I need to tell you about the period before the ship because nothing I'm going to describe makes sense without understanding why I was there. I was 41 when Forsyth let me go. The company had been acquired in the spring, and by October, the new parent had finished their efficiency assessment and started cutting. The process was polite, which somehow made it worse. The severance was fair: 12 weeks of pay, unused vacation, and a letter of recommendation that described my attention to detail and data integrity practices in language so generic it could have been written for anyone. I'd been there since I was 30. I walked out of the building on a Tuesday afternoon in late October with a cardboard box and a strange, hollow feeling that I kept trying to name and couldn't. My marriage had already been failing for about 2 years before any of that. Claire and I had met in our second year of university. We got married at 28, bought a semi-detached in Dartmouth in 2012. The problem was that we didn't fight, not never, but rarely, and when we did, it never quite resolved into anything. Over about 8 years, we'd gotten so good at smoothing things over that we'd stopped talking seriously about most things, and somewhere in the space between the mortgage and the commute schedules and the decision to quietly stop trying for children that neither of us ever said out loud, we'd become two people sharing a calendar rather than a life. By the time I lost the job, she'd been in the spare room for 4 months. We didn't officially separate until February. Even then, we handled most of it by text message. We were both too tired for drama. I kept the house while we sorted the finances, and then, when we sold it in March, I moved into a 1-bedroom on Roby Street in Halifax, above a Vietnamese restaurant. The ventilation was poor. I spent 3 months eating takeout from downstairs and applying for jobs online and checking my savings account with the steady, low-grade dread of watching a slow leak you can't quite reach to fix. I applied for 31 data analyst positions between November and March. 6 interviews, 2 final rounds, both of which went to someone else. I started broadening the search, which is how I found the posting from the Atlantic Marine Sciences Institute for a marine data systems technician position aboard one of their research vessels. I met maybe 75% of the listed requirements. The rest I was confident I could learn. I mentioned in my cover letter that I'd taken a marine science elective in university, which probably wasn't relevant, but gave me something to write. Besides, I understand spreadsheets and need a change of circumstances. I didn't expect to hear back. I heard back inside a week. The interview was with Diane Foster, a program coordinator, and Dr. Patricia Voss, a physical oceanographer at Dalhousie, who would be the chief scientist on the research program. Voss was precise, in a way I immediately respected. She asked me how I handled discrepancies between datasets, what my process was when 2 sensors gave you different readings of the same variable. I told her I'd trace back to the metadata, check calibration histories, and flag the discrepancy before accepting either reading if the spread was large enough. She wrote something down. Diane asked the teamwork and communication questions. I answered honestly. They offered me the job 10 days later. The salary was lower than Forsyth, but not catastrophically so, and the position included housing aboard the vessel, which meant my apartment costs dropped to essentially zero on any month I was at sea. When you're watching savings drain, that math becomes straightforward. I signed the contract, gave notice on the apartment, and spent the last 2 weeks of May doing the required maritime safety certifications, JSDCW basic safety training, sea survival, firefighting, and first aid. I'd never worked at sea before. I'd never worked anywhere that had a weekly muster drill. The training was thorough and a little disorienting, but in a way, I found clarifying. There were rules for everything, and procedures for when the rules didn't cover something, and a clear hierarchy for when the procedures ran out. After 2 years of dissolving structure in my personal and professional life, that was unexpectedly settling. The RV Peregrine was berthed at Pier 35 in the port of Halifax when I first walked aboard in early June 2018. She was 68 meters, built in 1994 at a shipyard in Bergen, Norway, operated by AMSI since 2003 after they acquired her from a Norwegian fishing research institute. She'd been refitted twice, 2006 and 2015, and the current configuration was a layered consequence of both. In the main lab, you'd have a rack of relatively modern Seabird CTD electronics next to a filing cabinet with paper logs going back to 2004. The data acquisition system ran on a Windows server from 2014 that nobody wanted to update because the proprietary software had compatibility issues with newer operating systems, and the vendor had gone out of business in 2016. The bridge had a fully current ECDIS navigation system and a paper chart table that actually got used. This combination of generations of technology living alongside each other was, I would learn, completely normal in research oceanography. The crew and science team together were about 18 people on a typical voyage. The marine crew, the people responsible for the ship itself, consisted of the captain, first mate, second mate, chief engineer, 2 assistant engineers, a bosun, and 4 able seamen. The science party varied, but usually ran between 6 and 10 people. Captain Richard Moreau was 53, from Rimouski, French-Canadian, and had been master of the Peregrine for 9 years. He went by Captain Moreau in most contexts, and by Rick with the few crew who'd known him long enough to get away with it. He was heavy-set and quiet, with the particular kind of competence that reads as being unimpressed by most things while paying careful attention to all of them. He ran a calm bridge. The first mate was Tom Hensley, around 45, wiry, with the specific high-energy practicality of someone who spent most of their adult life working outdoors in poor weather. Tom managed the deck crew and the operational logistics of research deployments. He was friendly in a surface way that wasn't quite warm. He knew the vessel's systems thoroughly, and he did not like schedule changes that came without advance notice. My direct supervisor on the science side was Paul Almeida, the marine systems engineer, responsible for the research instrumentation and electronic systems. Paul was 38, from Dartmouth, and had been with AMSI for 12 years. He had the slightly scattered manner of someone who spends most of their mental energy on systems problems, and a habit of starting sentences and then stopping to reconsider midway and starting again from a different angle. He taught me the ship's data architecture during the first 3 weeks aboard and was patient about it, which I appreciated. We worked well together. Chief scientist Dr. Patricia Voss was at Dalhousie University and was the principal investigator on the research program. She wore the same pair of rain pants on deck regardless of the weather, drank coffee in volume, and had the ability to hold extremely precise technical thinking in one part of her mind while carrying on a perfectly ordinary conversation in another. I found this admirable and occasionally unnerving. The other person I worked most closely with was Lena Dowd, a PhD candidate from Corner Brook running a sub-project on dissolved oxygen distributions. Lena was 28, efficient and self-contained in a way that made her easy to work alongside. She asked precise questions and didn't ask them twice. The summer 2019 voyage was the most ambitious program Voss had run in 3 years. We were doing a comprehensive physical and chemical oceanography survey centered on the Flemish Cap, a raised area of the seafloor east of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, at roughly 47 degrees north. The Cap sits at the intersection of the Labrador Current and the North Atlantic Current, one of the places in the Northwest Atlantic where cold Arctic water meets warmer subtropical water, and the mixing dynamics are complex enough to matter for a range of downstream questions: fish stocks, carbon cycling, heat transport. The survey had 30 discrete station positions spread across roughly 150 by 200 nautical miles, plus a set of continuous transect lines between stations. The program was planned for 22 days. We left Halifax on July 14, 2019. The departure had the usual chaos of a research cruise: last-minute gear loading, deck crews stowing equipment, engineers running checks. I'd spent the previous 2 days configuring the data acquisition systems and running test logging from every instrument aboard. Everything checked out. We cleared the harbor entrance around 1400 and headed east. The first 4 days were transit. The Peregrine cruises at about 11 knots, and it takes time to reach the study area from Halifax. I used the transit days to calibrate sensors and test the data pipeline with real underway measurements. We ran into a low east of Sable Island on day 3 and got about 24 hours of 2 to 3 meter seas. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make lab work uncomfortable. I spent most of it wedged at my bunk with a laptop, monitoring the systems remotely. By day 4, the weather had cleared, and we arrived at the first station just after dawn on July 18th. A research station in oceanography means a specific geographic location where you stop the ship and make a set of observations. For us, each station centered on a CTD rosette deployment, a stainless steel framework holding multiple scientific sensors and water sampling bottles, lowered on a steel wire to a programmed depth and recovered. The CTD provides continuous vertical profiles of water temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, fluorescence, and other variables. The sampling bottles collect discrete water samples at set depths, analyzed aboard and back in shore labs for chemistry. A full CTD cast to 1500 meters and back takes about 2 hours, plus setup and recovery time. We did 30 of these. I was on day watch, 0800 to 2000, for most of the program. Night casts were covered by Lena and a German exchange student named Felix Braun, who was meticulous, made good notes, and didn't generate unnecessary noise in the lab. The routines became second nature inside a week. Precast instrument checks, configuration, watch the CTD go over the side, monitor the data stream as it descends, watching for sensor spikes, drift, any sign of a problem, log the station metadata, recover the instrument, help process bottle samples, update the data files, archive in triplicate. The repetition sounds deadening, but it isn't, or at least it wasn't for me. There's a quality to the attention it requires that I found genuinely engaging. There's something else about life on a research vessel that I keep trying to describe and mostly failing at. The ship is small. You always know where other people are. The ocean is not small. At 50 nautical miles from any coast, the horizon in every direction is just water. And you are aware of this, constantly, in a way that doesn't produce fear exactly, but something, an alertness, a quiet sense of scale. I slept better at sea than I had slept on land in almost 2 years. The apartment, the divorce, the depleted account, still real, technically, but behind a membrane. What was real was the ship, the work, and the sea. The night of July 26 was 12 days into the voyage. We were in the central part of the survey grid, somewhere around 47 degrees, 12 minutes north, 44 degrees, 08 minutes west. The weather had been cooperative for 4 straight days. A moderate southwesterly swell, overcast, some fog, nothing serious. There'd been light rain the previous afternoon. I logged the sea surface temperature at 11.4 degrees Celsius. I wasn't supposed to be awake at 02:30. My watch didn't start until 0800. But I'd been dealing with sinus congestion for a couple of days, which is common on ships because of the recycled air, and I'd woken around midnight with a blocked ear that I couldn't sleep through. I lay in my bunk for an hour and then gave up and went to the main lab to check the overnight data stream. I did this sometimes. It wasn't strictly necessary, but it was useful, and it was something I could do while half awake. The main lab was quiet. Lena was at the CTD monitoring station, watching an active cast. Felix was at the far end labeling sample bottles. The ship's underway systems ran constantly, as they always did. The acoustic Doppler current profiler, the hull-mounted sensors, the GPS. In the corner of the lab, the GMDSS terminal scrolled its ongoing log of radio traffic. I made coffee from the lab pot and sat down at my workstation and pulled up the overnight logs. I should explain the radio setup on the Peregrine. The ship maintained several communication systems, standard VHF marine radios on the bridge and at other stations around the ship, an SSBHF radio for long-range comms, a satellite phone, and the GMDSS, the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System. The GMDS included DSC on VHF, the ship's own APERB, and an automatic system for monitoring international distress frequencies. The bridge maintained primary watch on the distress frequencies. The GMDS terminal in the main lab had a display showing signal activity, primarily used by the science party to monitor weather broadcasts and navigation warnings. It generated a continuous scrolling log. The data in the overnight logs was fine. I skimmed the CTD descent profile. Salinity clean. Temperature showing the expected thermocline structure. I'd been mildly concerned about a pressure sensor that had shown a small offset at the previous station, and I was checking whether it had stabilized. It had. I made a note and was about to go back to my bunk when I noticed something in the GMDS terminal log. The routine entries were what they always were: weather broadcasts, Navtex navigation warnings, automated maritime traffic, but there was a line that stood out by type rather than content. It was flagged as a 406 MHz signal. That's the APERB frequency, emergency position indicating radio beacon. I read it again. The system had decoded a partial ID string from the signal. Not complete, the signal had been weak, but enough for the system to classify it as a genuine APERB transmission rather than noise or interference. The timestamp on the entry was 0218. I'd been awake at 0218, but not at my workstation. I sat there for a moment. APERB signals in open water are not inherently unusual. Beacons get triggered accidentally by water incursion, by physical shock, occasionally by negligent storage. The bridge monitored the same frequencies, and if they'd received this, standard procedure was to contact MSRC Halifax, the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, to determine whether there was an actual emergency in progress. They might have already dealt with it. I pulled up the bridge communications log from the same period. Nothing logged. I wrote the timestamp and the partial ID string in my notebook. Then I went to find Paul. Paul's cabin was 3 doors down from mine in the science party berths. He came to the door in less than a minute, which made me think he hadn't been deeply asleep, or that his relationship with sleeping aboard ship was as complicated as mine. I showed him what I'd written. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said he'd check with the bridge. I went back to the lab and waited. He was back in about 10 minutes. The bridge was aware and had already called it in to Miss Mark C, he said. The Miss Mark C had no current distress report for that area, and the beacon ID fragment didn't match any vessel in their active records. The captain had decided they'd monitor the frequency for the next hour, and if the signal recurred, they'd take a bearing and assess. I asked what the partial ID string suggested about registration. Paul said he'd checked their beacon database, and the fragment didn't return a clean match to any registered Canadian vessel. It could be a foreign flagged vessel not fully in the Canadian database, a beacon with a transferred MZI that hadn't been properly updated, or a malformed signal that had triggered the system's classification logic without actually being a valid EPIRB. He said the signal strength put the source at roughly 20 to 40 nautical miles off, which was wide enough to be almost meaningless for navigation purposes. He seemed not especially concerned. I went back to my bunk. I thought about it for a while, in the dull, analytical way you think about things when you're tired. A real emergency would already be in the hands of the MSRC. My job was to document and report, which I'd done. Maritime distress signals are taken seriously, and they're also frequently explained by mundane causes. Beacons get wet. I told myself that. I fell asleep around 0400. In the morning, I asked Tom Hensley what had happened with the signal. He said it hadn't recurred during his watch, and the MERXI had confirmed at around 0310 that they had no active distress incident logged for the grid reference. He treated it as closed. I nodded and went to check the overnight data archive. But I wrote it all down again in my notebook before I did anything else. The time, our position, the bearing estimate, the partial beacon ID, the content of my conversations with Paul and Tom. I don't know exactly why. Professional habit from years of data work, probably. At Forsyth, we documented anomalies as a matter of course, even the ones that resolved into nothing, because the act of documentation is how you know later whether something was actually nothing. I didn't know yet whether this was anything. I just didn't want to lose the record. We ran 3 more stations that day and 2 that night. The work went smoothly. Lena got excellent data on Station 18 and found something interesting in her dissolved oxygen profiles that kept her at her laptop through dinner, which I noticed only because I passed her twice over the course of the evening, and each time she was in the same position with the same slightly absent look, the one she got when she'd found something worth concentrating on. I brought her coffee, and she thanked me without quite looking up. Felix had developed a problem with one of the spring-loaded bottle closers on the CTD rosette, a mechanical issue that wasn't affecting data but was aggravating everyone who worked with the sampler. He and Paul spent part of the afternoon on it, with wrenches and a spare closer mechanism. They got it functional, but Paul said it would need a proper repair at the next gap between stations. This wasn't his normal practice. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Lena's workstation with no particular expression, and then came across to where I was doing calibration record updates and asked quietly whether the 406 signal had shown up again. I said no. He nodded. He said, "Probably a false trigger from a fishing vessel." I agreed that that was likely. He left. I thought about that visit later. It was a natural thing for a captain to do after a communications anomaly. Check in, satisfy himself that the matter was resolved. But he'd come down to the main lab to ask me specifically, not the bridge watch officer or Paul, and there'd been something in the way he said probably that I noticed at the time but couldn't do anything useful with. You file these things. The next 2 days were routine in the very full sense of that word. The survey was going well. Voss had added 2 additional casts at stations that were showing interesting water mass structure, and we were still tracking close to the planned schedule. The weather held. I settled back into the work rhythm and thought less and less about the signal. It receded into the category of logged anomaly. Then, on the evening of July 29th, it happened again. I was at my workstation in the main lab around 2100 when the GMDSS terminal registered another 406 MHz signal. I noted the time immediately, 2047. The signal was stronger than the first one. The ID string the system decoded was longer, 406044. I called the bridge on the intercom. Tom was on watch. He said they'd already picked it up. He was calling Miss Mercy now. I wrote down the full decoded string from the terminal display as completely as I could read it, then wrote it again below to confirm what I'd recorded. Paul came into the lab 15 minutes later. He sat down at the communications terminal and went through the logs carefully. Then he ran the beacon ID against his databases. He sat without saying anything for long enough that I noticed. He has a particular stillness when he's concentrating. Finally, he looked up and said the ID came back as unregistered in the Canadian Beacon database. Not invalid in format, just not matched to any Canadian registered vessel. The country code fragment in the signal structure was consistent with UK or Irish registry, based on the prefix sequence, but he couldn't confirm without access to the international registry maintained by COSPAS SARSAT. He said Mercy Halifax would have much better tools. I asked about signal strength. He said the second reading was notably stronger than the first, 2 nights before. His estimate was 10 to 15 nautical miles, which was a meaningful improvement in confidence over the first estimate. The stronger signal suggested either the source was closer, or propagation conditions had improved, or both. We looked at the chart together. At our current position and the bearing of the signal, the source was somewhere in a rough ellipse of open ocean, roughly 10 to 15 nautical miles to our southeast. I looked at the area. No islands, no charted hazards, no marked anchorages, just deep water, 1,200 to 1,800 meters on the chart soundings. I asked whether the captain was altering course. Paul said the bridge was in contact with Missouri, and the captain would decide. He seemed calm. I stayed calm too, but I wrote down the chart position and the bearing and the depth soundings at the estimated source location. It took about 90 minutes of communication with Missouri Che before the decision came. Paul went back and forth between the lab and the bridge during that time. At 22:30, he came in and said we were going. I wasn't on watch. I stayed up. I went to the bridge around 2300 and stood in the back, out of the way. Moreau was there, and Tom, and Sandra Yee, the second mate. The bridge ran dark except for instrument displays and the navigation screens. Through the forward windows, the ocean at night had that quality of darkness that's different from any darkness on land, absolute, directional, total. The Peregrine covered the distance in under an hour. The signal faded at around 22:10 and didn't recur during the approach. The Merfor had told Moreau that they had no active distress incident logged in the area and no vessel reported overdue in the region. They had also told him something else, which I only learned later. They had no record of receiving the signal themselves. This was the part that didn't make sense to me when I heard it. The EPIRB system, at 406 MHz, feeds directly into the COSPAS SARSAT satellite network, which consists of multiple satellites in low Earth and medium Earth orbit, specifically designed to detect and relay these signals to rescue coordination centers worldwide. Any valid 406 EPIRB signal is supposed to be captured by the satellite network and forwarded to the appropriate RCC, almost automatically, within roughly 90 minutes or less, depending on which satellites have coverage at the time. A signal strong enough to register clearly on our ship's receiver from 10 to 15 nautical miles away should have been more than sufficient for satellite capture. It should have been in the Mirc's queue. I didn't have all the details of the Mirc communication at that point. I learned this particular piece later. At the time, I was standing on the bridge, watching us approach a position in open water with no vessel in sight. Tom and Danny Briggs went on deck with flashlights and binoculars when we got close. Sandra held us on station against the current and the swell. Moreau turned on the searchlights. I went on deck and stood at the port rail. The searchlights lit up a circle of water roughly 40 meters across. Beyond that, nothing. The sea had a low easterly swell that had moved in during the evening, maybe half a meter, and the surface had that smooth, dark quality it gets when the wind is light. You could see the searchlight reflection moving slightly with each roll of the hull. There was nothing there. No vessel, no wreckage, no debris, no oil sheen, no flares, nothing. We held position for 45 minutes. We made 2 slow passes in expanding circles. Tom called back that he'd found nothing. Moreau went below, around 0100. Tom handled the debrief with Merksey. I was back in the lab by then, but I heard the call on the bridge intercom through the open door. The Merksey duty officer had no further information. No satellite alert had been received. No other vessel in the area had reported picking up the signal. We were told to maintain watch and report any recurrence. We turned back toward the survey track and resumed work at dawn. I want to describe my mental state at that point because I think it matters for understanding how I processed what came next. I was not frightened. I was not convinced that something paranormal or impossible had occurred. I was curious in the specific and somewhat clinical way that I get curious about data problems. Something had happened that was not in the expected record. The signal was real. The GMDSS system had captured it twice, and Paul and Tom and the bridge and the Mesmer had all interacted with it. But the expected downstream consequences of a real EPIRB signal, a corresponding satellite alert, a registered vessel, physical evidence of a distress situation were all absent. That was a data problem. Data problems have explanations. I went through the possible explanations methodically, starting with the most mundane. A defective beacon could explain the lack of a registered vessel. People store EPIRBs improperly. Beacons get old, get wet, get dropped. A defective or improperly maintained beacon could produce a valid format signal without being attached to any current vessel. That would explain no vessel at the scene and a partial or missing registration. A satellite coverage gap could explain why Mr. Mirsi didn't receive the satellite alert. Coverage isn't instantaneous. If both signals had been emitted during gaps in the Cospas-Sarsat orbital coverage of that specific area, the satellite network might have missed them while our ship's receiver caught them on the direct RF path. A drifting separated beacon could explain the two position estimates being about 7 nautical miles apart. EPIRBs float. If a beacon had separated from a vessel, it would drift with the surface current. The Labrador Current in that area runs roughly northeast at somewhere between 0.5 and 1 knot. 7 nautical miles over 2 days is consistent with a slow drift. Each explanation was individually plausible. The problem was that all three needed to be true simultaneously to account for everything, and even then they didn't account for the complete absence of any physical evidence at the source location. A separated beacon from a vessel in distress implies a vessel in distress somewhere. Where? I wrote all of this out in my notebook. Not elegantly, it was 2-something in the morning and I was tired, but systematically. I dated the entry July 30 and included the coordinates of both signal reception events and the coordinates of where we'd searched. Then I went to bed. I slept badly, not because I was scared. I kept running through the explanations, testing each one for the place where it didn't quite fit. Over the next 2 days, I spent whatever time I had outside my formal watch duties doing 2 things. The first was reviewing the GMDS logs in detail, going back further than just the 2 signal events, to make sure I wasn't missing context. The second was trying to look up the beacon ID. The GMDS log review didn't produce anything new. The 2 signals were clearly distinguishable from the routine traffic. No other anomalous entries before or after. The beacon ID lookup was more complicated. Paul had databases on the ship, but they were limited. He had access to the Canadian Maritime Registry, a database of AMC-maintained instruments, and some general maritime reference materials. He didn't have direct access to the International EPIRB Registry maintained by Cospas-Sarsat and the International Maritime Organization, which would be the definitive source for identifying a non-Canadian beacon. I didn't either, but I had access to the internet through the ship's satellite internet system. The connection was slow and rationed. We were supposed to keep large data transfers for the science data pipeline and use personal bandwidth conservatively, but it was functional, and there was publicly available information about the beacon ID structure that I could use to at least partially decode what I had. I sat down in my off-watch time and worked through it. The 406 MHz APIRB encoding format assigns a 15-digit hexadecimal identification code to each beacon. The first 3 digits encode the country of registry as a decimal maritime identification code, MID. The MID for the United Kingdom is 232 through 235, depending on the specific national authority. Ireland is 250. Several other countries have codes in adjacent ranges. The partial string I'd recorded from the stronger second signal was enough to read the first several hexadecimal characters with reasonable confidence. Working through the conversion, the country code fragment was consistent with a MID of 232, which is the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. So if the beacon was validly encoded, it was a UK-registered vessel. The rest of the identifier, the vessel-specific portion, I could only partially read. The display on our terminal had limits, and the signal had faded before I could capture the full string. I had maybe 8 of the 15 characters, and 2 of those 8 I wasn't completely confident about. I wrote out the partial string, 449. With that much ambiguity, I couldn't do a definitive identification. The character set of 15 hex digits allows for an enormous number of possible unique IDs. What I had eliminated a lot of possibilities, but left a large number still open. I tried a different approach. I put the partial string and APIRB and distress into a few different search combinations and looked at what came back. Mostly, I got generic information about the APIRB system, maritime safety agencies, and old news stories about rescues that were clearly unrelated. Nothing that matched or narrowed the specific ID. I tried searching the geographic area itself. The Flemish Cap, distress, maritime incidents, beacon, rescue. There were results. There's a lot of maritime history in the Grand Banks and Flemish Cap area. Fishing grounds, shipping lanes, storms. Several notable disasters over the decades. Most of the results I got were about Grand Banks fishing incidents, which are relatively well documented because fishing vessels in that area are numerous and losses not uncommon. I went through several pages. One result caught my attention enough to click on it. It was a report from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, which handles maritime, aviation, rail, and pipeline incidents. The report was for a vessel that had gone overdue in 1998 and was never found. The vessel wasn't in the Flemish Cap area exactly. The last known position was south of it, around 46 degrees north. But the report mentioned that a 406 APIRB signal had been received by a nearby vessel before the MITC logged any corresponding satellite alert. The MITC in the report's analysis attributed this to a delay in the COSPA-SARSAT coverage for that orbit period. I read this twice. It was a direct parallel to what had happened with us. Another vessel detecting an APIRB signal before the MIRCA logged a corresponding satellite alert. The TSB report was dated 2001. The incident itself was 1998. The vessel that had gone missing was called the Esther Marie, a longliner out of Louisbourg, Nova Scotia. I wrote down the report number and the vessel name. I went and found Paul. I showed him what I'd found. He read it and then looked up at me. He said, "Coverage gaps are documented. That's what the report is saying." I agreed. That was what the report was saying. I said, it was also a documented case of another vessel detecting an APIRB signal in roughly the same part of the ocean before a satellite capture, and then the originating vessel never being found. Paul looked at me for a moment. He said, "Owen, the Esther Marie was a fishing vessel that went down in heavy weather. That's a very different situation." He wasn't wrong, I said. "I know, I just think it's worth noting." He said, "Worth noting in what sense?" I didn't have a good answer to that. I said I wasn't sure yet. He said, "The MISCOR has our reports. They have both signal times, both position estimates. If they think there's something to investigate, they have the resources to investigate it." He was right about that too. I went back to my workstation, but I printed the TSB report. The ship had a small inkjet printer in the lab. I printed it out and folded it into my notebook. The work continued. We were into the back half of the survey by now, finishing the southern transects and moving northwest through the remaining stations. Voss was pleased with the data set overall. There were 2 stations she wanted to revisit if time allowed, and she was running scenarios on whether to do additional transect legs or stick to the original plan. I overheard her talking through the options with Felix in the lab one afternoon, not in a way that invited input, but in the focused, half-to-herself way she sometimes worked through problems. She decided on the original plan. Lena had her own small discovery to manage. At Station 22, her dissolved oxygen sensors had shown an anomalously low oxygen layer at around 450 meters that wasn't predicted by the regional models. She didn't know what was causing it and was spending her free time poring through historical data on her laptop, trying to find precedent or explanation. She told me at breakfast on July 34th that she thought it might be a relict feature, some eddy-trapped low-oxygen water that had been isolated from the main water mass for long enough to lose oxygen through bacterial respiration. She seemed pleased with the hypothesis, but uncertain about it. Could also just be the sensor, she said. I told her the sensor was clean. I checked the calibration twice. She said, I know, I'm just leaving room. I like that about Lena. She left room. I kept researching the beacon on my own time and off the ship's main data network when I could. The satellite internet was slow enough that anything involving image-heavy databases was painful, but text content was manageable. I kept coming back to the TSB report, and then from there to a few other maritime incident reports in the same geographic neighborhood. There had been 4 documented maritime incidents in the broad Flemish Cap area that involved EPIRB signals in the previous 30 years, not counting the ones I was currently tracking. The Esther Marie in 1998 was one. Another was a container vessel that had a beacon malfunction in 2003. That one was clearly explained. Defective unit. No associated emergency. The vessel reported in fine condition 2 days after the signal was received. A third was a pleasure craft that went down in 2007. 2 persons recovered, 1 lost. The EPIRB functioned normally, and the Mercy received the satellite alert within minutes. The 4th was the one that gave me pause. It was a research vessel called the Dunmore. The Dunmore had operated out of St. John's, Newfoundland, under a charter arrangement with a consortium of universities, including Memorial, Laval, and one other I didn't recognize. It had disappeared in November 1989, 30 years before our current voyage. The last confirmed communication from the Dunmore was a weather report filed on November 8, 1989, giving a position about 90 nautical miles south-southwest of where we were currently surveying. After that, nothing. An air search was conducted over several days. A surface search covered a large area. Some debris was found, a life ring, some foam insulation material, what might have been part of a storage locker door, but no bodies. No major structural wreckage, no clear evidence of what had happened to the vessel or the people aboard her. The Dunmore had been carrying 11 people. The TSB incident report, published in 1991, listed the cause as undetermined. What stopped me was a single paragraph near the middle of the report, in the section summarizing initial incident notification. At 0243 local time, on November 9th, 1989, the CCG's Sir Wilfrid Laurier, a Canadian Coast Guard vessel, on patrol approximately 45 nautical miles northwest of the Dunmore's last known position, reported receiving a 406 MHz EPIRB signal of unknown origin. The Sir Wilfrid Laurier altered course toward the estimated bearing. No source was located. The Maritime Rescue Subcenter in Halifax had no corresponding COSPAS SARSAT satellite alert on file at the time of the Laurier's report. The signal was not received again. I read this 3 times. Then I went and found the MISR-C communication records from our current incident. Paul kept copies in the comms folder on the lab network. I read through them. Our signal received July 27th at 0218. No satellite alert at ISR-CC. Our signal received July 29th at 2047. No satellite alert at ISR-CC. The Dunmore incident. Signal received November 9th, 1989 at 0243 local. No satellite alert at MISR-CC. The structure was identical. Vessel receives EPIRB signal. No corresponding satellite record. No source found. In 1989, the Dunmore was already lost. I sat with this for a while. The obvious interpretation was one I was reluctant to accept, because it was also the most dramatic one, and dramatic interpretations of ambiguous data are usually wrong. The obvious interpretation was that we had somehow received a distress signal from a vessel that had been gone for 30 years. That was not possible. EPIRBs have finite battery lives. A real beacon from 1989 would not still be transmitting in 2019. The batteries in most EPIRBs are designed to last a minimum of 48 hours in continuous operation, with some units capable of 7 days, not 30 years. But the coincidence was striking enough that I wrote it all down. Position, date, time, ID fragment. The 1989 incident. The overlapping geographic area. The same structure of vessel receives signal before satellite capture and finds nothing. I was also starting to do something I do when a data problem won't resolve cleanly. I was building a timeline, a real one, on paper, in the back pages of my notebook. Every relevant event I knew about, in order. It was incomplete, but it was an effort to see the shape of the thing. On August 2nd, I decided to try to find more about the Dunmore. The internet research was limited by the connection speed, but I made progress in fragments. The Dunmore had been a 42-meter vessel built in the late 1960s in Leith, Scotland. She'd worked as a survey vessel in North Sea oil exploration for most of the 1970s and 1980s, before being purchased by the University Consortium in 1987. She'd done 2 successful research voyages before the one she was lost on. 11 people aboard on the final voyage, the captain, 6 crew, and 4 scientists from Memorial and Laval. The research program she was running in November 1989 was a benthic survey, studying the seafloor communities and sediments. They had been working the southern part of the Flemish Cap area. I want to be clear about what I mean by the same area. The Flemish Cap covers a substantial geographic extent, roughly 200 nautical miles across at its broadest, and the specific survey area I was working in 2019 was somewhat different from the Dunmore's 1989 working area, but there was overlap. The 1989 working area was in the southern portion of what we were surveying in 2019. The grid squares weren't the same, but they were adjacent, and the position where the Sir Wilfrid Laurier received the 1989 signal, approximately 45 nautical miles northwest of the Dunmore's last known position, was within about 20 nautical miles of where we'd received our signals in 2019. I didn't put this in the ship's formal logs. I wasn't sure what I would put, exactly. Possible connection between current unexplained EPIRB signals and a vessel lost 30 years ago wasn't a scientific observation. It was a hypothesis about a coincidence, and a weak one. I kept it in the notebook. That evening, August 2nd, I had a conversation with Paul that has stayed with me. I wasn't planning to bring up the Dunmore, but Paul and I were both in the lab in the early evening after dinner, and there was a lull in the data processing where neither of us had anything urgent to do, and I mentioned that I'd found an interesting historical incident in the same area. He asked what I meant. I told him about the 1989 incident with the Dunmore, the similarity of the EPIRB signal structure, the overlap in geography. I laid it out in the same methodical way I would have laid out a data quality problem at Forsyth. Here are the facts. Here is the structure that seems to repeat. Here is what I can and can't conclude from it." Paul listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've heard the name Dunmore before." I asked where. He said, "I'm not sure. Something in the AMSI files, maybe. We have a lot of historical voyage records. It could have come up in the context of research in this area." He said he'd look it up if he got a chance. He didn't seem alarmed or particularly curious. He seemed a little subdued, maybe, but I put that down to fatigue. We'd both been working long days. I went back to my workstation. I wrote up the Dunmore material in the timeline in my notebook. Then I noticed something. It was small, and I almost passed over it, and I've thought about it many times since. The station list for our current survey was posted on the lab notice board, where it had been since the beginning of the voyage. It was a printed A4 sheet showing the numbered station positions, their coordinates, and their planned sequence. I'd looked at this list many times over the course of the voyage. I knew it well. One of the stations in the southeast corner of the grid, Station 24, which we'd already completed on July 25th, had a coordinate next to it on the sheet that I was nearly certain was different from the coordinate in the original cruise plan that I'd been given before the voyage. The latitude on the notice board was 46 AME degree 58 N. My copy of the original cruise plan, which I'd saved on my laptop, showed 47 AME degree 04 N. That was a difference of 6 nautical miles. I pulled up my laptop and compared them. They were different. 6 nautical miles in a station position isn't nothing, but it's also not a drastic discrepancy. Cruise plans do get adjusted. Voss might have shifted the station to capture different water mass characteristics or to avoid a conflict with another survey in the area. The change might have been made before departure, and I'd been given an outdated electronic copy. There were several mundane explanations, but I hadn't been told about a change, and it was my job to know about changes to station positions because they affected how I configured the instrument logs and coordinate stamps. A change to a station position should have come through me, or at least past me. I went through my email archive on the ship's system, looking for any message that had announced a change to Station 24. I didn't find one. I asked Voss the next morning. She looked at the notice board and then at my laptop screen and said, "I didn't change that one. When did this happen?" I said I didn't know. She said she'd check with Diane Foster back at AMSI because station changes were supposed to come through the program office. She didn't seem especially worried, but she was slightly narrowed around the eyes in a way that meant she was paying attention. She came back 2 hours later and said Diane had no record of a change to Station 24, and the original cruise plan in AMSI's files still showed 47 AWay degree N, matching my electronic copy. We both looked at the notice board. The sheet was the one that had been posted at the start of the voyage. It had the AMSI logo at the top, and Voss's name as chief scientist, and the voyage number. It looked original, but the coordinate was different from every other version of the plan that existed in the record. Voss took the sheet down and kept it. She said she'd look into it when we were back in port. She put a new printed copy of the station list up, pulled from her laptop's version of the cruise plan, which matched mine. I wrote all of this down. That was August 3. The station position discrepancy was probably nothing. I kept telling myself that because it was true. Sheets get reprinted with typos. Coordinates get transposed. Someone at AMSI might have corrected the plan at the last minute and printed a revised sheet without updating the main file and without emailing anyone. This kind of administrative slippage happens in research programs. It's irritating but normal. I kept the thought in the notebook anyway, with a note that neither AMSI nor Voss had an explanation for the different coordinate. What happened over the next several days was not any single dramatic event. It was a series of small things, each of which had a mundane explanation available, that taken together began to feel like a pattern. I'm going to try to describe them accurately, because I've thought a lot about how much the pattern was real and how much was the way a tired person's attention gets shaped by what they're already looking for. I'm not sure I can fully separate those, but I can tell you what I actually observed. August 4. I was archiving the previous day's CTD data, which was a daily task. Each station's data file was named with the station number and date in the format I'd established at the start of the voyage. When I opened Station 23's data file to verify the archive had completed correctly, I noticed the timestamp embedded in the file's header was off by exactly 24 hours. The instrument clock had logged the cast as occurring on July 28th rather than July 29. I went back to the handwritten deck log to verify. The deck log showed July 29th, which was correct. I corrected the embedded timestamp in the data file and noted the discrepancy in my QC log, as I would for any data quality issue. Instrument clocks drift and occasionally reset. It was routine. Except that I'd checked the instrument clock on July 29 specifically because I was already attentive to timestamps after the APERB events. My notes from July 29 said the clock was correct at 1600 that day, within 2 seconds of GPS time. 4 hours later, the instrument had logged the cast with a timestamp 24 hours in the past. A clock that's off by 2 seconds doesn't jump back 24 hours. Those are different failure modes. I checked the system logs on the data acquisition server to see if there was any record of a clock reset or system event between 1600 on July 29 and the start of the Station 23 cast. There was a gap in the server's own event log between 22:31 and 23:18 on July 29th, 47 minutes, with no entries at all. That was also unusual. The server logged its own heartbeat every 60 seconds under normal operation. A 47-minute gap with no heartbeat entries meant either the server had been offline or the log had been modified. I didn't modify it. Paul was the only other person with administrator access to the server. I wrote this down very carefully, including the exact times and the content of the log entries before and after the gap. August 5. We were transiting between stations, a few hours of running before the next cast position. I was in the lab, working through some backlogged calibration documentation when Lena came in and sat down at her workstation. She looked tired. We'd all been tired for a while by then, which was normal for this point in a voyage. I made some remark about the passage going well, and she said, "What was the thing you found? In the radio logs?" I looked at her. I said, "The APERB signals?" She said, "Yes. I heard you talking to Paul about it. Was that ever resolved?" She'd been there for the second signal event. She'd been in the lab at 2047 on July 29th when the terminal registered. I'd seen her. We'd briefly discussed it. I remembered the conversation. She'd asked what the signal type was, and I'd said APERB, and she'd said that was unusual out here, and then gone back to her work, because it was my job to deal with it, and not hers. I said, "You were in the lab when the second one came in." She looked at me blankly for a moment, not in a performative way, in the way where she was genuinely searching her memory. She said, "Was I? I remember the first one that you mentioned in the morning, but I don't remember being there for another one." I said, "July 29th, around 2047, you were at your workstation looking at the oxygen data." She thought about it. She said, "I might have been. I was in and out of the lab a lot that day. I just don't remember it clearly." I said, "We talked about it briefly. You asked what signal type it was." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm sorry, I don't remember that conversation. Could you have been thinking of Felix?" Felix had not been in the lab that evening. He'd been off watch, and I'd seen him head aft toward the deck to check the winch settings for the next day's cast. This was in my notes. I said, "No, it was definitely you. You were working on the dissolved oxygen anomaly." She said, "I'm sure you're right. I've just had a lot of long days." She sounded apologetic, not defensive. She turned back to her work. I went and checked my notebook. The entry for July 29th at around 2050 read, "Lena in lab, mentioned signal to her. She asked type, said EPIRB was unusual, went back to O2 data. The note was there. The conversation had happened, but Lena didn't remember it. I sat and thought about that for a while, without moving. Then I wrote it down again, below the original note. Asked Lena about her memory of this. She does not remember the conversation or the signal event. Says she may have been in and out. People forget things. This is one of those statements that is both absolutely true and absolutely useless as a standalone explanation for anything specific. August 6. This was the one that made me stop and sit with real discomfort for a sustained period. I was going through the ship's formal data archives, not the instrument data, but the operational logs, the deck log, which recorded all significant events in ship operations, and the scientific operations log, which recorded station activities. These were maintained separately, the deck log primarily by the watch officers and the ops log by the science party. Both were important for the record. Researchers would reference them years later when using the dataset. I was checking a routine discrepancy between the ops log and one of my instrument records, just a timestamp alignment issue, nothing serious. I had both logs open on the lab computer. The ops log entry for July 29 read, Station 19 cast completed, 2210. All sensors nominal. Dataset archived. Station 19 had been completed on the night of July 29th. That was correct. I had been present for part of it, though not the whole cast, because Lena and Felix were on watch, and I'd come in to monitor while I was investigating the EPIRB signal. The cast had ended at around 2211, which I knew because that's when the signal faded. The two events had been roughly concurrent. The deck log entry for that same evening read 2047 2230, ship's position 47 ADRI 19, when 44 ADRI 01W. All routine operations, CTD cast completed Station 19. This is what I want you to understand about what I was looking at. The deck log said we were at 47 A Wayne 19 Sria and 44 A Wayne 01 2230 on July 29th. I had notes, made at the time, showing that our position when we received the EPIRB signal at 2047 was approximately 47 A Wayne 22 2044 A Wayne 05 20W. After the signal, we had altered course toward the source and traveled to the estimated source position, covering roughly 10 to 15 nautical miles. A 10 to 15 nautical mile transit would take between 55 minutes and 90 minutes at our cruise speed, but the deck log showed our position as constant from 2047 to 2230. We could not have been at 47 A019 1044 A01W at 2047, altered course to travel 10 to 15 nautical miles toward a signal source, spent 45 minutes searching, and returned, while the deck log showed us stationary at the same position for that entire period. Either the deck log was wrong, or I was wrong about what had happened that night. I pulled up the GPS navigation record. The ship's ECDIS system logged position continuously. I had access to the position export files, which I used for georeferencing the scientific data. I opened the file for July 29th. The GPS log showed the Peregrine at approximately 47 AA degree, 22 Menisferine, 44 AA degree, 05 Pranis W, from 2100 to approximately 2150. It showed a course change at 2052 from the station work track toward a bearing of roughly 145 degrees. It showed a transit of approximately 13 nautical miles. It showed the ship returning to the station area and resuming station operations at around 2300. The GPS record matched what I remembered. We had gone, we had searched, we had come back. The deck log did not reflect any of this. The deck log showed us stationary the entire time. I sat with this for about 10 minutes. Then I printed both records. The printer was in the corner of the lab. I folded the printouts and put them in the back of the notebook with the TSB report. The scientific ops log didn't have anything for the transit period. It went from the station 19 cast completion at 22:10 directly to the next morning's entry. But the ops log was the science party's log, and we'd been busy with the appeared response during that period, and nobody had stopped to log it. That at least made sense. The deck log was a formal document. Deck officers are responsible for its accuracy. Everything that happens on a ship is supposed to be in the deck log. We had gone off survey track, altered course, conducted a search operation, and returned, and none of that was in the deck log. I want to be precise about what I felt at that moment. It wasn't fear, still. I was past fear, or rather I'd never quite gotten to fear, because I kept encountering things that could still have mundane explanations. A deck log can have an error. Officers can forget to note something, or log it incorrectly. The gap in the data server's heartbeat log could be a software bug. Lena could have simply forgotten a brief conversation at a stressful moment in the voyage. The station coordinate discrepancy could be an administrative error. Each explanation worked individually. The explanations were becoming numerous. I thought about the data quality work I'd done for 11 years. At Forsyth, when you found multiple uncorrelated anomalies in a dataset, the explanation was rarely that each anomaly had its own independent cause. When several different things looked wrong simultaneously, they usually had a single underlying cause that was expressing itself in multiple ways. The question wasn't why each anomaly existed. The question was what the common cause was. I didn't know what the common cause was here, but I was increasingly certain there was one. That evening, I wrote a careful and deliberately temperate email to myself, to my personal Gmail account, not a ship system, summarizing everything I'd documented so far. The APARB signals, the TSB reports, the Dunmore incident, the station coordinate discrepancy, the server log gap, Lena's memory lapse, the deck log anomaly. I included dates, times, coordinates, and a description of each piece of evidence. I kept the language neutral and factual. I didn't use words like impossible or strange. I described what I'd observed and what the documentation showed. The ship's satellite internet routing was managed by Paul. All outbound traffic from personal devices went through the ship's system. I sent the email and watched it queue. It showed as sent in my outbox. 3 days later, when I checked from the same account on my personal device, the email was not there. There's something I missed, or rather skimped on, when I described the search operation itself on the night of July 29. At the time I recorded it in the notebook in a fairly spare way. Arrival at position, nothing found. 45 minutes on scene, transit back. I was cold and tired, and I wrote down the facts. But the facts don't quite convey what it was like to stand on that deck. The sea that night was quiet, in a way that the North Atlantic rarely is. The low easterly swell had a long period, maybe 10 seconds between crests, and the ship moved on it in a slow, steady roll without much pitch. The searchlights were the only lights except for the red and green of our navigation markers and the dim glow from the bridge windows. When you turned away from the searchlights, your eyes eventually adjusted and the stars were visible, which surprised me. We'd been in fog or overcast for most of the trip out, and I'd forgotten what the sky looked like from out here. Tom and Danny worked methodically. Tom had binoculars and was scanning slowly, sector by sector. Danny moved forward along the rail and back, looking at the water surface in the searchlight radius. The ship turned in a slow circle and then began the expanding pattern, which meant we were moving, but not fast, barely 2 knots, and the water surface stayed lit and empty as we described the arc. I don't know what I expected to find. A life raft, maybe, an emergency flare or its residue, floating wreckage, some sign that a vessel had been here and something had gone wrong. Instead, there was just the surface of the ocean, illuminated and unremarkable, the swells passing under us without carrying anything. I stayed on deck, For about 20 minutes of the 45 we were on scene, the air was cool, around 10 degrees Celsius, with a light offshore smell that's different from the coastal sea smell, colder, emptier, harder to describe. I wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. I was very awake. At some point during those 20 minutes, I had the specific feeling of being watched from below. I want to be careful about how I say that, because it's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to mean precisely. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. It was a feeling, and feelings are unreliable evidence. I noticed it because it wasn't the kind of thing I usually feel. I'm not a superstitious person, and I don't generally anthropomorphize bodies of water, but I stood there at the rail, looking at 1,600 meters of dark ocean below me, and felt, very clearly, that I was at the surface of something that was occupied. I went back inside after that. The thing about that feeling, which I've thought about many times, is that it might have been the simple physiological consequence of everything I'd been thinking about for the previous 2 days. The signal, the missing registration, the absence of physical evidence. You think about an EPIRB signal long enough, and you start thinking about what an EPIRB is for, which is to mark a location where people are, or were, in serious danger. The water surface at night in deep ocean has enough quality of darkness about it that an already primed imagination doesn't need much help. I'm sure that's all it was. I'm fairly sure. What I can say is that when the captain decided to call off the search and return to station, I was ready to go. The transit back took the same hour as the transit out. I was in the lab by the time we arrived back at the station position. Felix had kept the watch going, and the overnight cast was in progress. He looked up when I came in and said, "Anything?" I said, "Nothing." He nodded and went back to his screen. The normalcy of that, the clean and specific nothing of it, was in some ways the strangest part. We'd gone out into dark water to look for the source of a distress signal and found nothing, and we came back and the station work was proceeding and Felix was monitoring his cast, and the sea was the same sea it had been, and by morning the whole thing would be logged as a maritime anomaly and we'd be on to the next station. Except that it wasn't fully logged, and that's where everything else began. I want to say something about why I kept going, kept researching, kept accumulating documents in the months and years after the voyage ended. It would be easy to say it was purely professional compulsion, the data analyst unable to tolerate an incomplete record. There's truth to that, but there's something else too. The Dunmore carried 11 people. One of them, P. Santos, had the same job title as mine, Marine Systems Technician. That's the specific title, not just the general category. Marine Systems Technician is not a common job. When I found that crew manifest in the AMC archive and saw that title next to the name Santos, I felt something that I didn't entirely recognize and took me a few days to identify. It was a kind of proximity, not to a person I knew, but to a situation that could have been mine. A person doing what I do, on a vessel doing what my vessel does, in the same body of water, and then one night, apparently, a signal, and then nothing. I'm not going to say I felt haunted by that. The word is too dramatic, and the sentiment is probably too self-centered. Whatever happened to the Dunmore was about the Dunmore's crew and scientists, not about my feeling a professional connection to someone I never met, but it mattered to me in a way I didn't fully anticipate. I wanted to know what happened to them, not in a morbid sense, in the same sense that I wanted to know what the signal was, because a gap in a record means something happened, and I'd spent my career believing that things that happened had reasons, and reasons could be found. Maybe that belief is wrong. Maybe some gaps in records are permanent. Maybe some events don't leave enough traces for the traces to tell you anything useful. I've had to make room for that possibility over the past 3 years, and I'd be lying if I said making room for it was comfortable. There were small things about the voyage that I've continued to think about in ways I can't entirely account for. One is Lena's face when I told her she'd been in the lab for the second signal event. The way she searched her memory, the specific quality of uncertainty in it. She wasn't lying, she wasn't being evasive, she genuinely didn't remember, and she was puzzled by not remembering, in the way a person is puzzled when they expect to find something in a pocket and their hand closes on nothing. It's the absence of the expected thing that's strange, not the absence itself. Sandra's face had had that same quality when I asked her about the decklog entry, not blank, not defensive, uncertain, reaching for a memory that wasn't quite there. I've thought about this in connection with the 47-minute server log gap. A gap in the server's own heartbeat log means, technically, that the server wasn't logging during that period, which could mean a software process failed, or the server restarted, or the logs were cleared afterward. But it could also mean something I've been less willing to think about directly, that during that 47 minutes, the normal operation of time sequential record-keeping on the ship was disrupted in a way that affected both the electronic records and possibly the human memory of events in that period. I don't know how to write that sentence without it sounding like I'm saying something impossible. I'm not claiming anything impossible. I'm noting a correlation between the server log gap and the gaps in two separate people's memories of the same time period, and saying that I don't have a good explanation for that correlation. Maybe the correlation is spurious. Most correlations are. But 3 years later, Tom remembers clearly, and Sandra and Lena don't, and the server log gap is specifically in the period they're unclear about, and I was not on the bridge or in the lab during those 47 minutes. I was on deck, and my memory of that period is clear, for whatever that's worth. Something else I've kept coming back to is the printed Dunmore decklog page I found in my almanac. I've looked at it many times. The formatting is period appropriate, typewritten, and carbon printed, which would have been standard for a 1989 vessel log. The paper is degraded slightly, in a way consistent with age, though this could be reproduced. I have no way to authenticate it, but if it was fabricated, who fabricated it, and for what purpose? It was in my personal possession, in a book in my own bunk, at sea. The most likely explanation for a document appearing in my personal effects is that I put it there, which means I printed and filed it during the voyage and then forgot. The content is consistent with other documented aspects of the Dunmore's final voyage. If I printed it, I must have found it somewhere in the ship's archives or online during my investigation. I've searched for it since. I can't find it anywhere that would explain where I found it during the voyage. It's not in the publicly available TSB investigation record. It's not in the AMSI digital archive that I've been able to access. The DFO technical library isn't publicly searchable. Either I found it in a source I've since lost access to, or it arrived in my almanac some other way. That's as far as I can take that thread. The last thing I want to say about this, before I let it rest for a while, is about a conversation I had with my mother in December 2021 when I was visiting Truro for the holidays. She's a practical woman, a retired nurse, not given to the kind of thinking I've been doing about this. I told her about it, more completely than I'd told most people, because I was tired of carrying it mostly alone, and because she has the quality of listening that doesn't require you to edit yourself. She listened for a long time, then she asked me what I thought was actually happening. I said I didn't know. She said, "Is not knowing something you can live with?" I thought about it. I said, "Not comfortably." She said, "You might have to." She wasn't being dismissive. She was being accurate about what the options were. She was a nurse for 30 years, and she watched people have to live with medical uncertainties that were sometimes resolved and sometimes weren't. And she learned how to tell them that, and how to say it without cruelty. I've thought about that. Living with not knowing. The difference between an open record and a closed one. Most records close. Data problems resolve. Anomalies turn out to have causes that make sense in retrospect. That's the professional experience of 20 years working in data. Not all of them do. I know that now in a way I didn't before. The folder is still on my desk. The USB drive is still in the drawer. The notebooks are still on the shelf. The terminal on the Peregrine is still running, right now, tonight, wherever the ship is. I'm not on it tonight. I'm ashore, writing this. But Paul is, and Moreau is, and the GIMDS system is scrolling its log in the main lab, weather broadcasts, and navigation warnings, and the routine traffic of the Atlantic. And somewhere out there, at approximately 47 degrees north, 44 degrees west, the water is 1,600 meters deep and cold, and the current runs northeast at half a knot, as it has since, long before there were ships to sail it, or instruments to measure it, or records to be kept. I don't know what's there. I don't know if anything is. But I know the signal was real. I know the record says a vessel was lost there in 1989. I know the questions I have don't have answers I can put in writing, and I know that DFO told me to retain my documentation and then stopped returning my messages. I keep thinking about Cast 14, about whatever Farquhar was trying to measure when the signal came in, about the note in the manual, the careful professional handwriting, a scientist doing a job and recording a thing that didn't fit and then writing it down anyway, because that's what you do, you write things down. I don't know what he found that night. I don't know what he saw, but he asked for it to be logged. He said, "Put this in the record." So I have. The email was not in the sent folder either, which is what you'd expect if the connection had dropped before transmission. It was not in drafts. It was simply not there. I told myself the most likely explanation was that the satellite internet had dropped during the send. The message had failed silently without generating an error notification and had been discarded rather than queued for retry. This happens. Mobile and satellite mail clients have inconsistent behaviors around failed sends. I told myself this. I wrote the email again, by hand, in the notebook, the whole thing, dated it August 6. Then I went to find Tom Hensley. Tom was on the bridge, doing his evening admin, which was mostly review of the next day's operations plan. I came in and asked if I could talk to him for a minute. He turned around from the chart table and said sure. I asked him about the deck log entry for the evening of July 29. He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who has been asked an unexpected question. He said, "What about it?" I said I'd been reviewing operational records, and the deck log for the 29th showed us stationary at station position from 2047 to 2230. But the GPS export showed us making a transit to the south during that period for the APERB search. Tom said, "We went out to look for the signal source. The captain made the call." I said, "Right, I know, I was there, but it's not in the deck log." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Are you sure?" I said I'd read the entry. He said he'd look at it. He turned to the deck log binder, which sat in its slot under the chart table, and flipped to the page for July 29. He read it. He read it again. He said, "Huh." I said, "Is it possible the entry was made by someone else that watch?" He said Sandra had done the 2000 to midnight watch entry for that period. He pulled the crew roster to check. He said, "Sandra's the one who would have logged it." I said, "Do you remember it?" He said, he remembered going out and searching and finding nothing. He said it was clear as anything in his memory. He said, Sandra must have just missed it when she wrote the entry, or it got summarized and the summary didn't include the transit. He sounded confident, but he also picked up a pen and wrote something in the margin of the deck log page, right then, an annotation noting the omission. I watched him do that. Then I said, "Did the Mississippi know we'd made that transit?" He looked up. He said, "We reported our position when we were on scene. They knew where we were." I said, "Is there a record of that communication?" He looked at me for a moment, not hostile, just measuring something. Then he said, I'd have to check the radio log. Why are you asking about this? I said I was trying to make sure the incident was fully documented in case the Mr. Milisi ever needed to follow up. He said, Owen, the Miscruzi has the full report. There's nothing more for us to document at this point. I thanked him and went back to the lab. He was probably right that there was nothing more to document. The Miscruzi had the report. The matter was in their hands. Whatever the APERB signals were about, we had reported them correctly, and the appropriate authorities had been notified. My job was to maintain the scientific data record, not to investigate unexplained radio signals. I knew all of that. I also couldn't stop. The thing about working in data for a long time is that you develop an almost physical discomfort with incomplete or inconsistent records. Not a paranoid discomfort, or at least not necessarily paranoid. It's more like the feeling of a wrong note in a piece of music. Your brain notices it before you consciously process it, and then it keeps noticing it, and you can't unhear it. The record was wrong somewhere. Either the deck log was wrong, or the GPS record was wrong, or my memory and notes were wrong. One of those things was not consistent with the others. That's the kind of problem I spent 11 years solving. I started thinking about what I could and couldn't establish from sources I trusted completely. The GPS position export was data I managed myself. I'd set up the logging system, I maintained it, I understood how it worked. The file I'd pulled was a raw binary export from the ECDIS that I'd decoded using the vessel's nav data management software, which I also managed. That file was as close to a primary source as I could get. The navigation plot it showed, the course change at 2052, the transit, the return, was either accurate, or the GPS and ECDIS systems had both failed simultaneously in a coordinated way that happened to match my personal recollection and my contemporaneous notes. That was extremely unlikely. The deck log was a paper document maintained by officers I trusted, but in which I had no personal role. It had been wrong before. All paper logs have occasional errors. The difference was that this error involved omitting an entire operational event, not a typo in a timestamp. I wanted to talk to Sandra Yi. She had been on watch during the relevant period and presumably had written the entry. Sandra was a private person. She did her job very well and didn't volunteer much. I'd had pleasant but shallow interactions with her over 14 months. I found her the next morning during the turnaround period between watch changes. I asked her about the July 29th entry in the deck log. I framed it as a data record question because it was. She said, "The 29th?" I said yes. The night watch. The period between about 2000 and midnight. She looked at the middle distance in the way people do when they're pulling up a specific memory. Then she said, "We were on station 19. I logged the cast completion." I said, "We also went and searched for the EPERB signal during that period." She said, "Did we?" She said it in a tone that was slightly uncertain, not dismissive, as if she was checking her memory against what I'd said and finding it inconclusive rather than contradictory. I said, "We altered course around 2052. The captain decided to go look for the source. We were out there for a bit over an hour." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I remember the signal. I remember the bridge watching for it. I don't have a clear memory of us actually leaving the station." She sounded genuinely puzzled, not defensive. Not like someone who'd made an error and was covering for it. More like someone who was looking for something in memory and it wasn't quite there. I thanked her and went back to the lab. I stood at my workstation for a while without doing anything. Tom had a clear memory of the transit. I had a clear memory. I had notes made at the time and GPS data to support the memory. The deck log, which was Sandra's responsibility, didn't reflect it, and Sandra's memory of the period was unclear, not absent entirely, but uncertain in a way that was different from Tom's and mine. I thought about Lena's memory of the second signal event, also uncertain, absent really. I thought about the server log gap, 47 minutes, with no heartbeat entries. I thought about the email that wasn't there. I thought about a research vessel called the Dunmore, and a Coast Guard ship called the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and a signal received in November 1989 that was never explained. Then I stopped thinking about it for the rest of the day, by an act of will, and I focused on the work. I was good at focusing on the work. I'd always been good at that. We completed stations 25 through 28 over August 7th and 8th. The survey was winding toward its end. Voss had made her decision about the final stations, and we were running more or less to the original plan. The data being collected was good. That part was straightforward, and I held on to it. Felix came to me on the morning of August 8th to ask about a data processing question for his German institute, something about how our calibration documentation would be formatted for archiving after the voyage, because they had specific metadata requirements. I walked him through it. He took notes. His German background meant his data documentation habits were impeccable and occasionally more thorough than ours, which I respected. At some point during that conversation, talking about calibration records and metadata standards, I mentioned that I'd found some interesting material about historical research in the area while doing some background reading. He said, "The Dunmore?" I looked at him. He said, "I saw that name in the station background documentation that Dr. Voss circulated. There was a reference to some 1980s research in this area that our survey was building on." I said, "I didn't see that in the documentation she sent." He said, "It was in the supplementary file. Maybe it didn't come through to everyone." I asked if he still had it. He went to his laptop and looked. After a few minutes, he said he couldn't find it in his downloads folder, but he thought it had been in a PDF that Voss had attached to one of the early pre-voyage emails. I went through my own pre-voyage email archive. I had several emails from Voss with attachments. I checked each one. I found the cruise plan, the instrument deployment protocols, the watch schedule, the emergency procedures, the student responsibilities document. I did not find any supplementary background documentation mentioning the Dunmore. I asked Voss at the next opportunity whether she had sent supplementary background material about historical research in the area. She said, "I sent the cruise plan and the instrument documentation." I said, "Felix mentioned a PDF with some background on earlier surveys." She thought about it. She said, "I may have sent something in the planning phase, before you came on board for this voyage. There was a literature summary that I circulated to the science party in the spring." She said it matter-of-factly. That document had gone to the researchers and students before I'd been included in the email chain. It wasn't strange that I hadn't seen it. It would have been strange if Felix didn't have it. But when Felix had looked, he didn't have it either. I went back to Felix and asked him to look again. He went through his email more carefully this time. He said, "I'm sure I saw this. I remember reading something about an earlier benthic survey program. Whether it specifically said Dunmore, I'm less certain." He frowned at his inbox. "I can't find it anywhere now," I said. "Not in the attachment, not in the body of a message?" He said, "Nothing. Maybe I'm thinking of something I read at the university before we left." Maybe. Felix's preparation for the voyage had been thorough. He'd done background reading at his home institution in Germany before crossing the Atlantic. The Dunmore had been involved in benthic research in this area in 1989. It was plausible that he'd read about it in some academic context before the voyage, and the memory had attached itself to a shipboard document in the way memories sometimes do. I wrote it down anyway. Felix mentioned seeing Dunmore in a shipboard document. Cannot locate this document. May have been pre-voyage reading. By August 9th, I had been keeping my parallel notebook for about 2 weeks. It was getting full. I was on my second Blue Hilroy. The first was in my bunk. tucked inside a copy of a navigation almanac I'd brought aboard and never used. The second I kept on my person most of the time, in the breast pocket of my fleece. I had stopped trying to find the mundane explanation for each individual anomaly and started trying to understand the shape of what was happening, because the shape was the thing I could maybe get traction on. What the record showed, stripped of interpretation, an APIRB signal received twice from a position in open water. No satellite capture both times. No physical evidence at the source location. A partial beacon ID consistent with UK registry. A gap of 47 minutes in the data server's heartbeat log on the same night as the second signal. A deck log entry that omitted an hour-plus operational event on that same night. The relevant watch officer's memory of the period was unclear. A crew member's memory of a conversation about the signal event was absent. A station coordinate on the notice board that differed by 6 nautical miles from all other versions of the document. No record of when or why the change was made. No one who authorized it. An email I sent to myself that was not in my account when I checked. A reference to a document that Felix remembered but could not locate. A historical incident from 1989, structurally identical to our current situation. Vessel receives APIRB signal. No satellite capture. No source found. The vessel the 1989 signal may have been from was lost in the same general geographic area. Each of these could be explained away individually. I'd spent 2 weeks doing exactly that, but something had changed in the previous 48 hours, and I think it was this. I'd stopped believing that the explanation for each individual anomaly was actually independent of the others. When you see a dozen things go wrong in a system at roughly the same time, the question isn't why each thing failed. The question is, what happened to the system? On August 10th, I did something I'd been avoiding because it felt like it was crossing a line I hadn't quite defined. I went looking through the ship's historical voyage files. The Peregrine had been operating under AMSI since 2003, and before AMSI, under the Norwegian Institute, and the vessel's own record-keeping went back to the original commissioning in 1994. For the AMSI period, voyage records were kept in a networked archive on the lab server, scientific data, cruise reports, instrument records, deck logs, and general correspondence for every voyage the ship had done under AMSI's operation. I had access to this archive because I needed it to do my job, to check instrument calibration histories that sometimes went back years, to verify data formats and metadata standards used in previous programs. I was not supposed to use it to research a historical incident that wasn't related to current operations, but I also wasn't not supposed to. There was no policy against it that I was aware of. The files weren't restricted, exactly. My access credentials worked without requiring any additional authorization. I think the implicit expectation was that the data tech wouldn't need to browse voyage records from 2007 for any work-related purpose, and there was therefore no particular reason to restrict access, and therefore no formal rule one way or the other. I told myself this while I was doing it, which is the kind of internal justification that only works if you don't look at it too hard. I searched the archive for references to the Dunmore. There were none. The AMSI archive started in 2003, 14 years after the Dunmore's loss. I hadn't expected to find anything, but I'd wanted to check. I searched for references to the Flemish Cap area more broadly, to get a sense of how much research AMSI had done in the region before our current program. There was quite a bit, multiple voyages going back to AMSI's early years, a mix of research programs and contract work. I wasn't going to read all of it. I searched for any record of previous APIRB or maritime emergency events involving the Peregrine. There were two. One from 2009, a fishing vessel they'd sighted in apparent distress, which they'd responded to before the Coast Guard arrived, and everyone aboard the fishing vessel was fine. One from 2014, the Peregrine's own appearb had been accidentally activated during a deck maintenance operation, triggering a response from Miss RC that had taken several calls to stand down. Both incidents were documented in detail, with full accounts of the Miss communications and the operational decisions made. Both were logged in the deck log for the relevant dates. I searched for the name Moreau and found, alongside the expected current voyage records, a handful of references to Captain Moreau in older voyage reports, in contexts like Captain Richard Moreau, Master, at the top of cruise reports. He'd been with the vessel since 2010. I found his first appearance in the records as the Peregrine's master on a voyage report dated March 2010. I searched for Paul Almeida for similar reasons and found him throughout the archive going back to 2008. He'd been with AMSI longer than the captain. Then, because I'd been thinking about the 1989 incident, I tried to find whether any of the current crew had any historical connection to any of the documented maritime incidents in the Flemish Cap area. This was probably the furthest I'd pushed the search in terms of things that had nothing obvious to do with my job. I searched for Sir Wilfrid Laurier on the chance that anyone currently aboard had previously worked on that vessel. The Sir Wilfrid Laurier was a Canadian Coast Guard ship, not a research vessel, so a career crossover was unlikely, but not impossible. People in the maritime world often move between different types of vessels. The search returned nothing. I searched for Dunmore one more time, this time adding the date range 1987 to 1992 to the search metadata, hoping to catch any indirect references. I got one result. It was a technical manual for a CTD instrument, published by the manufacturer in 1990. The manual was a common document that would have been aboard dozens of vessels, but the copy in AMSI's archive had a handwritten notation on the cover page, R.V. Dunmore, Voyage D4, November 1989. This was, as far as I could tell, a document from the Dunmore's last voyage. Somehow, it had ended up in AMSI's archive. I stared at this for a while. Then I thought through how it could have gotten there. After a vessel is lost, its effects and documents are usually collected by the owners or the investigation authorities. Some materials end up donated to institutions. Some get archived by individuals. If the Dunmore's technical library had been recovered or partially reconstructed after the loss, and if some of those materials had eventually made their way to AMSI when AMSI was setting up their own technical library in 2003, a technical manual from the Dunmore could have ended up digitized as part of a broader collection. That was a plausible explanation, slightly circuitous but plausible. Technical manuals get shared and passed around and accumulated. It wasn't evidence of anything in itself. I opened the manual anyway. It was a PDF scan of a fairly standard instrument documentation package. Inside the front cover, below the handwritten notation, was a stamp reading Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Technical Library, Halifax. So the document had been DFO's before it was AMSI's. That was actually a much simpler provenance. DFO had a large technical library and shared documents with AMSI on a regular basis. The Dunmore might have done work under DFO charter, or DFO might have simply collected her manuals as part of the incident investigation. I kept looking through the PDF. Most of it was technical content for the instrument, calibration procedures, maintenance schedules, output formats, nothing relevant. Near the end was a section of handwritten notes, the kind of field notes a scientist or technician would make during actual instrument operation, apparently added to the manual as a working record. The handwriting was neat but small. The pages had been scanned at lower resolution than the rest of the manual and were harder to read. The notes covered several cast operations, dates, late October and early November 1989, positions, coordinates in the southern Flemish Cap area, which matched the Dunmore's documented survey area. I read through the notes carefully. They were technical field observations, instrument behavior, water mass characteristics, any problems with the equipment. They read like my own notes, the ones I made in my QC log every day. There was an entry for November 7, 1989. This would have been the day before the last confirmed communication from the Dunmore. The entry read, CTD cast 14, position 46A degree 51 meters, 44A meters, 22W. Depth 1,820 meters. Salinity anomaly in lower 200 meters. Cross-referencing with previous station. Significant temperature inversion at 1,100 meters, not in regional model, worth flagging for Chief Psi. Minor noise on pressure sensor, corrected by reseating connector. Signal on spare radio receiver, 406 MHz, 030 local. Duration uncertain, reception spotty. Duty officer, called Halifax. Halifax, no record. I read it twice, 3 times. Signal on spare radio receiver, 406 MHz, 0030 local. Duration uncertain, reception spotty. Duty officer called Halifax. Halifax, no record. The Dunmore had received a 406 MHz signal the night before her last contact. That signal was not in the TSB report. The TSB report had documented the Sir Wilfrid Laurier receiving a signal after the Dunmore went missing. The report said nothing about the Dunmore itself receiving a signal the night before. I sat very still for a long time. Here is what I had now. A vessel that disappeared in the Flemish Cap in November 1989 had, the night before its last contact, received an APIRB signal on 406 MHz from an unknown source. The duty officer had called Halifax. Halifax had no record. 30 years later, in the same general area of ocean, our vessel had received the same type of signal, twice, from an unknown source. Each time, Halifax had no record. And the Sir Wilfrid Laurier had received a signal after the Dunmore was lost. Halifax had no record. 3 separate vessel incidents in the same geographic area across 30 years, all with the same structure. Unexplained 406 MHz signal received. MEMRC contacted. MEMRC has no record. I printed the relevant page from the manual. I included it with the other printed documents in the notebook. Then I sat back and thought about what I was actually looking at. The data quality mind wants to find the common cause. The common cause in a dataset where 3 related events have identical unusual properties is usually one of 2 things. Either the events really are related in a way that produces the shared property, or there's a systematic error in the measurement or recording system that makes unrelated events look identical. Option 2 would mean there was something about the GMDES system or the MISRC's record-keeping or maritime communication infrastructure in the Northwest Atlantic that systematically produced a pattern of vessel receives 406 signal, MISRC has no record. Maybe the 406 MHz frequency in that geographic area had a particular interference pattern that created false signal events. Maybe there was a persistent satellite coverage gap over the Flemish Cap that prevented Cospas Sarsat from capturing signals in that area. Maybe Miss Mercy Halifax had a systematic record-keeping problem in a specific category of incident. Option 2 was the less alarming option, and I genuinely tried to believe it was the explanation. The problem was this: the Dunmore had received the signal before it disappeared. The Sir Wilfrid Laurier had received the signal after the Dunmore disappeared, from a position consistent with where the Dunmore had last been working. Our ship had received signals from the same general area 30 years after the Dunmore was lost. If it was a systematic equipment error, it had been producing false 406 MHz signals in the Flemish Cap area for at least 30 years, reliably enough that every vessel that worked in the area eventually received them. That would be well documented. The GEMS documentation, the Navtex archives, the maritime safety literature, somewhere, this would be a known interference source. I'd read enough GEMS documentation in the past 2 weeks to be fairly confident it wasn't. Which brought me back to option 1. The events were related in a way that produced the shared property. I didn't know how to complete that sentence. Related how? What was the property they shared, beyond the geographic location and the technical format of the signal? A vessel that went missing, a signal received from where it had been working, 30 years of signals from the same place. What was the relationship? I didn't have an answer. I wrote down everything I had, in order, in the notebook, and I accepted that I didn't have an answer. What I did next was something I had been thinking about for several days. I went to find Paul, and I asked him directly whether he knew anything about the history of APIRB signals in the Flemish Cap area. He was in the instrument workshop aft, doing the proper repair on the bottle closer mechanism. He had a piece of stainless steel rod clamped in a bench vise and was measuring it with calipers. He didn't look up when I came in. I asked the question. He put down the calipers. He turned around. He said, "What are you asking?" I said I'd found a reference in the ship's archive to a technical manual from the Dunmore. I said the manual had field notes in it that mentioned the Dunmore receiving a 406 signal the night before her last contact. Paul was quiet. I said, "The structure is identical to what happened to us. Signal received, Halifax no record. I found 3 instances of it in the historical record in this area. The Dunmore is the one I can't stop thinking about because she disappeared and because the Sir Wilfrid Laurier received a signal from the Dunmore's last position after she was gone." Paul said, "Owen." I waited. He said, "I know about the Dunmore." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, it's not an unknown vessel in this area. The historical context of the program, Voss knew about it. The Dunmore had been working on a benthic survey that's a precursor to what we're doing now. The AMSI program is in part a continuation of work that was interrupted in 1989. I said, "She didn't tell me that." He said, "It wasn't operationally relevant to your role." I said, "The APIRB signal from the night before the Dunmore's last contact, was that in the briefing materials that went out before the voyage?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know what was in the pre-voyage materials. That would be something Voss compiled." I said, "Felix mentioned seeing a document with the Dunmore's name in it. He can't find it now. I never had it. Did you see it?" He said, "I may have seen a background document before the voyage. I don't remember the details." I waited. He said, "Owen, I think you've found some genuinely interesting historical material, but I'm not sure what you think it means." I said, "I think something about this area produces APIRB signals that no one can account for, and I think the Dunmore received one the night before she went missing, and I think we've received 2, and I think that matters." He held my gaze for a moment. He said, "The Dunmore was lost in a storm. The investigation found evidence of structural failure consistent with severe weather. The APIRB note in that manual is interesting, but it doesn't change what the investigation concluded." I said, "The investigation concluded cause undetermined." He said, "There's a range of conclusions that satisfy that. Equipment failure in heavy weather is one of them." I said, "Did the investigation look at the signal?" He said, "If there was a signal in a text field notes in an instrument manual, I don't know whether that reached the investigators. It would depend on whether anyone found and reviewed that manual." That was probably true. A handwritten note in the back of a technical instrument manual that ended up in a DFO archive and then in an AMSI digital library was not obviously something a 1990 marine investigation would have had access to. The manual had belonged to the Dunmore Scientific Instruments. Its subsequent path to an AMSI archive was exactly the circuitous sort of thing I'd hypothesized. DFO collected it as part of the incident record or through General Instrument Library Exchange, digitized it at some point, shared it with AMSI. I thanked Paul and left the workshop. He had not told me not to look into it further. He had not told me to stop. But something in the conversation had the quality of a door that doesn't close cleanly. It settles back toward the frame, but doesn't quite latch. I went back to the lab and thought about it. That night I couldn't sleep again. I lay in my bunk and thought about the Dunmore, and about 11 people, and about the sea around us at this moment, and about signals that no one could trace to a source. I got up around 0200 and went to the lab. Felix was there, alone, monitoring an overnight cast. I made coffee and sat at the GMDIS terminal and just watched it for a while. Felix looked over at me at some point and said, "Can't sleep?" I said no. He said, "I've been thinking about what you asked me earlier, about the document." I remembered where I first read about the Dunmore. I looked at him. He said, "It was a paper from 1992, a physical oceanography survey paper published in a German journal. The paper referenced preliminary data collected in 1989 in the Flemish Cap area by a vessel called the Dunmore, which was subsequently lost. It said the preliminary data had been recovered by the university group and incorporated into the study." I said, "That paper, was it something you found before the voyage?" He said, "Before the voyage, yes. I was doing background reading. The paper was by a German co-author from Kiel, which is why I found it." I said, "Did the paper say anything else about the Dunmore or the 1989 data?" He thought about it. He said, "Only that the data had been collected in the southern Flemish Cap area, and a footnote mentioning that one of the co-authors wished to acknowledge the Dunmore crew and science team." He paused. He said, "There was something slightly unusual about the footnote. I remember thinking it was oddly phrased. It said, 'The authors acknowledge the contribution of the science team of RV Dunmore, Voyage D4. Data recovered, covers casts 1 through 13 only.'" I said, "Casts 1 through 13. He said, "Yes." In the instrument manual, the last field note entry was for cast 14, the cast on the night of November 7, 1989, the cast during which someone had noted receiving a 406 MHz signal. The data from cast 14 had not been recovered. I slept for 3 hours, and then the watch schedule pulled me up at 0800, and I went to the lab and worked through the day as if none of it were happening. That's something I want to be clear about, because I think it's relevant to how seriously to take what I'm describing. I did not let any of this interfere with the science. The data records from our voyage are complete and accurate. Every station, every cast, every calibration check, all the QC logs and metadata, properly archived and formatted. I can say that with confidence, because I did it, and because I am good at it, and because whatever else was going on in the back of my mind during those weeks, my professional responsibilities were not one of the things I was allowing myself to fail at. Partly this was because the work was good work and I valued it. Partly it was because focusing on the work was the only reliable way to get through days that were becoming increasingly strange. We reached Station 29 on August 11th, and Station 30, the last of the planned program, on August 12th. Voss had decided not to add the supplementary casts. We were on schedule, and the dataset was complete, and there was nothing in the data that required extending the program. She made the announcement at dinner, and there was the particular kind of exhausted satisfaction around the table that comes from finishing a piece of research work. Lena had resolved her oxygen anomaly hypothesis to her satisfaction, at least tentatively. Felix had his full data set and was looking forward to the transit back. Paul had finally fixed the bottle closer mechanism properly. Captain Moreau announced we'd begin the transit back to Halifax on the morning of August 13th, weather permitting. The forecast was for moderate conditions for the first 2 days, and a high-pressure system settling in over the Nova Scotia coast by the time we arrived, which put us back in Halifax around August 17. I had spent part of August 11 and 12 making sure my documentation was complete. Not the scientific documentation, which was in good shape, but my personal record of the anomalies. The notebook was thorough but disorganized. I'd been writing in it under a variety of conditions over 3 weeks, and the entries jumped around in time and subject matter. I spent 2 evenings making a clean timeline on the last pages of the second notebook, organizing everything in chronological order. There was something clarifying about seeing it all in sequence. The shape of it was more visible that way. The APIRB signals had preceded the record anomalies. The signals were July 27th and July 29th. The server log gap was also July 29th. The station coordinate discrepancy I'd noticed on August 3, but the sheet had been posted at the start of the voyage, so the discrepancy had existed from the beginning, and I just hadn't looked carefully at that particular station. Lena's memory issue, August 5. The deck log omission. I'd found it on August 6, but it dated to July 29. The failed email, also August 6, discovered on August 9. Felix's missing document, August 9. The Dunmore manual, August 10. The record anomalies clustered around July 29. The day of the second signal. The day we had altered course and searched and found nothing. I kept thinking about the 47-minute gap in the server heartbeat log between 2231 and 2318 to DeVry C12 on July 29th. The transit we'd made to the search position had taken roughly 55 minutes, covering about 13 nautical miles at approximately 14 knots. We'd been on scene for 45 minutes and then transited back, taking another 55 minutes. The total elapsed time from the course change to resuming station operations was about 2 hours and 8 minutes. The server log gap covered 47 minutes of that. 47 minutes, in the middle of the transit period. The server had been running before and after, just not during that specific window. Or the log had been modified to remove those entries. I'm going to stop pretending I wasn't considering the second possibility, because by August 11th, I was considering it directly. If someone had wanted to obscure a period of time in the record, they might have cleared the server's heartbeat log for that period. That would require administrator access, which Paul and I both had. It would require knowing which log files to clear. It would require a reason for wanting the record obscured. I did not believe Paul had done this. That's an important thing to be clear about. I didn't believe it because I knew Paul, because I'd worked with him for 14 months, and because the Paul I knew was not the kind of person who did that kind of thing. But I also recognized that my judgment of people is not infallible, and that not the kind of person is a confident statement about a person's character, based on limited observation, not a logical certainty. I wasn't accusing Paul, even in my own thinking. I was noting the possibility. The deck log was a different matter. The deck log was maintained by the watch officers, not by Paul or me. For the deck log to have been altered, either Sandra had made a genuine error in her entry, or someone with access to the deck log binder had altered it after the fact. Deck logs are paper documents. They can be altered. They can also have pages removed. I hadn't counted pages. I was aware that I was starting to think in ways that a rational person should be cautious about. When you're looking for a pattern, you can find one in almost anything. Coincidences happen. People forget conversations. Server logs have glitches. Deck logs have errors. All of these things are true and normal. The fact that they all happened in the same 2-week period on the same ship is alarming, but it's less alarming than it sounds if you consider that you only spend time analyzing events for internal consistency when something initially anomalous attracts your attention. The anomaly was the APIRB signal. The anomaly made me look. Looking revealed the other inconsistencies, but would I have noticed those inconsistencies if I hadn't already been looking? The station coordinate, would I have checked it against my saved document copy without a reason to verify records? Oh, probably not. So maybe the inconsistencies were always there. Normal, everyday slippage in a busy working environment, and I was only seeing them because I'd been primed to look. Maybe, but the Dunmore was still there. The Cast 14 field note was still there. 3 separate incidents over 30 years in the same body of water, all with the same structure. I put the notebook away and spent the rest of August 12 helping pack up the scientific equipment for the transit, making sure everything was secured and inventoried. The work was physical and straightforward, and I was glad of it. On the morning of August 13, we started back toward Halifax. The first day of transit was uneventful in every sense. The weather was mild, the sea light, the ship steady. The science party was in the relaxed post-program phase that comes after the last station is done and before you're close enough to port to start thinking about what waits there. People read, people slept. Felix started writing his field notes into proper documentation. Lena was already beginning to draft the preliminary analysis of her oxygen data. Voss spent most of the day in her cabin working on the cruise report. I processed the final data archive and ran a last round of quality checks on the complete dataset. Everything was clean. Then I sat at my workstation and thought. I had 2.5 days of transit time. I was going to use some of it to see what else I could find. I went back to the ship's archive and looked more carefully at the DFO connection. DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, was one of the Canadian federal agencies that conducted and funded marine research in the Northwest Atlantic. AMC had a long relationship with DFO, including various contract arrangements and data sharing agreements. The Dunmore Manual, having come through DFO's technical library, was consistent with a documented relationship. I searched for DFO in the AMC archive more broadly. The results were extensive. Years of correspondence, data agreements, research permits. I narrowed the search to correspondence about the Flemish Cap program specifically. There was a chain of emails from the period when the current research program was being planned, roughly 2017 and 2018. The chain included Voss, Diane Foster at AMC, and a contact at DFO named R. Shaughnessy, who appeared to be in DFO's science branch. The early emails were about research permits and data protocols, routine stuff. About a third of the way through the chain, there was an email from Shaughnessy that contained a paragraph that made me stop. Read the historical context you mentioned. Yes, we have a record of the D4 voyage program, and the connection to the current survey objectives is something we noted when reviewing your application. We would be interested in coordinating the data archiving for the new program with the existing D4 material, which is in our possession. We would also ask that, if any anomalous observations are made during the survey that might be relevant to understanding the D4 incident, these be reported to our office as well as to the standard AMC research channels. This is a standard request for programs in this area. I read this several times. DFO had material from the D4 voyage. D4 was the Dunmore, voyage D4. DFO had material from the Dunmore's last voyage. DFO had asked AMC to report any anomalous observations that might be relevant to the D4 incident. This was a standard request for programs in this area. What did that mean? Standard request for programs in what area? In the Flemish Cap? In a specific part of the Flemish Cap? Standard in what sense? They asked this of everyone, or they asked this of programs with a particular historical connection. I searched the email chain further. There were follow-up emails about data format agreements and logistics. Then there was an email from Voss acknowledging the request and agreeing to the reporting protocol. Nothing that clarified what DFO meant by standard request, or what exactly the D4 incident involved for them. I thought about Paul saying, AMC's program is in part a continuation of work interrupted in 1989, and about Voss agreeing to report anomalous observations to DFO. We had reported the appeared signals to Mr. Merci. The Merci was not DFO, but they were both federal agencies. Was there a mechanism by which an emergency maritime safety report would be seen by DFO's science branch? I didn't know. Government interagency communication in Canada is not something I had expertise in. I sent another email to myself. This time, I composed it on my phone using the satellite data connection rather than through the ship's routing system. I wrote the same summary as before, adding the DFO material. I watched it send. I kept the draft copy on the phone. When I got to Halifax, I would check whether this one arrived. On the evening of August 13, I went to find Voss. She was in her cabin, the door partway open. She was at her laptop. I knocked, and she looked up, and I said I had something I wanted to ask her about, something I'd come across in the ship's archive. She said to come in and sit down. I told her what I'd found in the email chain with DFO. I said it as neutrally as I could. I'd been reviewing historical correspondence as part of the data archiving work. I'd come across the email from Shaughnessy about the D4 voyage. I was curious about what that request meant in practice. She listened without expression while I spoke. When I finished, she said, "What specifically are you curious about?" I said, "DFO asked you to report anomalous observations. We received 2 unexplained APIRB signals. Did you report them to DFO?" She said, "I reported them through the standard channels, the MISR-C communications." I said, "Shaughnessy said to report to their office as well." She said, "I'm aware of what Shaughnessy said." I waited. She said, "Owen, I appreciate the thoroughness, but the reporting arrangements for this program are between AMSI, DFO, and the relevant maritime authorities. The APIRB events were reported appropriately. If DFO needs additional reporting, that's something AMSI and DFO manage directly." I said, "Was there separate reporting to DFO?" She looked at me for a moment. She had the specific quality of attention I'd noticed about her from the beginning, the ability to hold something in mind while doing or saying something else. She said, "That's not part of your role." She said it without any particular edge. It was a statement of fact, in the same tone she used to say most things. But it was the first time, in 14 months, that Patricia Voss had answered a question I asked, by telling me it wasn't my role to know. I said, "I'm not asking to be difficult. I've been trying to understand what's happening with these signals. I found the Dunmore material, and I found the pattern in the historical record. If DFO already knows about this pattern and is tracking it, that's actually reassuring. But I'd like to know whether someone knows about it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What pattern?" I told her, carefully, the same way I'd told Paul, the 3 incident instances, the structural similarity, the Dunmore's Cast 14 field note. She listened all the way through. When I finished, she said, "That's a significant thing to have pieced together." I said, "Is it already known to someone, DFO?" She said, "I can't tell you what DFO knows. I can tell you that you should include a summary of these observations in the cruise report's supplementary remarks. That's the appropriate channel." I said, "A supplementary remark isn't the same as an investigation." She said, "No, it isn't." And that was the end of the conversation. I went back to my cabin. I sat on my bunk and thought about what she had and hadn't said. She hadn't said the pattern was unknown. She hadn't said it was unimportant. She'd said to put it in the cruise report remarks, and that she couldn't tell me what DFO knew. Can't or won't are 2 different things, and I didn't know which one she meant. I wrote the supplementary remark. I wrote it that night because the alternative was lying awake trying not to think, and the writing at least felt like doing something. I made it 3 pages in the cruise report format, which was considerably longer than a typical supplementary remark, but shorter than what I actually had to say. I described the 2 APIRB events, their dates and positions, the characteristics of the signals, the Miss Mark's response, and the search operation on July 29th. Then I described the historical research I'd done, the TSB incident reports, the Dunmore, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Cast 14 field note, and the structural parallel between all three incident records. I kept the language factual and measured. I did not speculate about cause. At the end I wrote, "These observations may warrant further investigation." The author recommends that MIRCSI Halifax and DFO's Science Branch review the full record of APIRB incidents in the Flemish Cap area, including the 1989 events, for any pattern that might indicate a persistent signal source or other systematic phenomenon. Anquet. I saved it and copied it to my personal laptop. The second day of transit, August 14th, was quiet. I finished the supplementary remark and attached it to my draft contribution to the cruise report, which I sent to Voss for review. I did not hear back from her that day. In the afternoon, I had a conversation with Danny Briggs. Danny was one of the ABs from Cape Breton, a friendly and competent deckhand who'd been aboard the Peregrine for 6 years. We'd talked fairly often during the voyage, mostly over meals. He had the quality of attention that some people develop after long stretches of working at sea, an unforced alertness, everything registered, but nothing dramatized. We were in the mess having afternoon coffee, and Danny was talking about the weather on the way back, and I found myself asking, casually, whether he'd noticed anything unusual during the voyage. He said, "Like what?" I said, "Anything. Equipment, routines, anything that seemed off." He thought about it. He said, "The EPIRB thing was unusual." I said, "What did you think of it at the time?" He said, "Honestly, I thought it was a bit odd that we searched and found nothing. But that happens. Beacons get separated from boats, float off." He paused, rotating his mug. "What was funny was afterward." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The next morning, the morning of the 30th, I went on deck to do a safety check, early, around 0600, and one of the life rings on the starboard side was gone. I looked at him. He said, "Not missing. It was in one of the deck storage bins. Someone had taken it off the bracket and put it in storage. I put it back." I said, "Did you ask anyone about it?" He said, "I asked the bosun. He said someone must have swapped it out. He wasn't worried about it." I said, "Was it a different life ring, like it had been replaced?" Danny thought about it. He said, "Same one, as far as I could tell. Same number painted on it. Just in the bin instead of on the bracket." I said, "Did you log it?" He said, "I put a note in the deck maintenance record. Yeah, just noted that the ring was found in storage and replaced. I wrote this down when I got back to the lab, August 14th. Life rings go missing from brackets for various mundane reasons. Storage bins are used for things during rough weather. It wasn't alarming by itself. I noted it and moved on. What I kept coming back to was the morning of July 30 being the morning after we'd returned from the search. If someone had gone overboard during the search operation, if we'd been looking for something more than a signal source, something that had been in the water, then a life ring might be removed from its bracket and used. The ring had been found in storage, not missing entirely. If it had been deployed and retrieved, it would go into storage rather than back on the bracket, because wet equipment gets dried before it's re-racked. I knew I was speculating. I wrote it down because I'd promised myself to write down everything factual, and the life ring in the storage bin was factual. The third day of transit, August 15th, brought weather. A front had moved south faster than forecast, and we were in 3 to 4 meter seas by midday. Winds from the northeast at 25 to 30 knots. Not dangerous, but uncomfortable. The Peregrine handled it without trouble. She was a solid ship, and Moreau drove her well. But it kept most of the science party in their cabins and made working in the lab the kind of activity that required one hand for the work and one for yourself. I was in the lab at around 1500, in the middle of backing up the last of the data archives to the portable drives we'd carry off the ship, when Paul came in. He sat down at his workstation and began working. We were in the same space for 20 minutes without speaking, which was not unusual between us. Then he said, without looking up from his screen, "I've been thinking about what you showed me, the Dunmore material." I waited. He said, "There's something I should have mentioned earlier." He stopped, restarted. In 2003, when AMSI acquired the Peregrine from the Norwegian Institute, there was some archival work done as part of the institutional transfer. One of the things that came over with the ship was a small collection of technical documents that had been aboard the vessel since before the Norwegian period. Some of them went back to the 1980s. He said, "The Bergen Yard did the original fit-out, but the vessel's research instrumentation history is complicated. Some of the early documentation came from Canadian sources." He paused again. "I don't know the full provenance, I just know it exists." I said, "Are these in the ship's archive?" He said, "Part of the collection is in the archive. I don't know whether all of it is." I said, "Paul, what are you telling me?" He turned around and looked at me. He looked tired. He said, "I'm telling you that the Dunmore connection might be more direct than a DFO library transfer. That's all I can tell you." I said, "Does Voss know?" He said, "Voss knows the research history of this area." I said, "Does Moreau know?" He said, "That's not my area." He turned back to his screen. I didn't push further. I wasn't going to get more from that conversation, and I knew it, but I had the specific feeling of a question that has just become less abstract and therefore more uncomfortable to think about. What did it mean for the Dunmore connection to be more direct than a library transfer? The instruments on the Peregrine were from the AMSI fit-outs in 2006 and 2015, all modern. The hull was Bergen-built from 1994, before the Norwegian Institute owned her. The documentation history Paul was describing, technical documents that had come with the ship from Canadian sources before the Norwegian period, would need to predate 1994. If Canadian research documents from the late 1980s had ended up aboard a ship built in Norway in 1994 and then transferred to AMSI in 2003, the path they'd traveled was not straightforward. The Dunmore had been built in Leith, Scotland, not Bergen. She'd worked in North Sea oil. She'd then done research under the Canadian University Consortium. Then she'd been lost. I didn't see how the Peregrine could have carried Dunmore materials from before the Peregrine existed, unless the vessel-to-vessel connection wasn't about the physical ships, unless it was about people or programs or institutional relationships that transferred between different vessels in the same research community. Researchers move between programs. Technicians carry documentation from one vessel to another. Equipment gets refurbished and redistributed. A technical document from a 1989 research program could travel from the Dunmore to DFO to a Canadian institution to a Norwegian institute's archives to the Peregrine in a dozen different ways over 30 years, none of which would necessarily be documented. I wrote all of this down and then stopped because I was going in circles. I had the habit of cataloging possibilities when I didn't have evidence, and all it did was produce longer and longer lists of things I couldn't confirm. The weather started easing on the evening of August 15, and by the morning of August 16, we were in lighter conditions, maybe 1.5 meters, and Halifax was less than 12 hours away. I did something in the late afternoon of August 16 that I've thought about since, in terms of whether it was reasonable or whether I was getting irrational. I went through the ship's voyage record physically, not the digital archive, the physical paper records that were kept in the captain's filing cabinet and a secondary binder in the bridge. I didn't have access to the captain's filing cabinet, but the secondary binder on the bridge held copies of the current voyage's deck log, watch schedules, and Missmark C communications record, and it was accessible to all crew. I'd looked at it before for routine navigation record purposes. I went to the bridge when it was quiet. The officer of the watch was the second mate, Sandra Yee, She gave me a neutral look when I came in, but didn't say anything. I went to the binder. I looked at the Merck Sea Communications record. This was a paper log of all formal radio communications with the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, maintained by the bridge watchkeepers. It should have had entries for both EPIRB events, both calls to Mismetsi to report the signals, and the responses received. The entry for July 27th was there. Time, 0237. Nature, 406 MHz signal detection. Position estimated 20 to 40 nanometer SE of vessel. Messer C informed. Messer CC response. No satellite alert received. No active incident in the area. Maintain watch. The entry for July 29 was not there. I went through the pages carefully, front to back. The entry for July 29th, which should have been between the entry for July 27th and the next entry, July 31st, a weather broadcast acknowledgement, wasn't there. The pages were consecutive. I checked the page numbers. No missing pages. The July 29th communications weren't there, and there was no sign that they had been removed. Sandra Yi was watching me from the bridge chair. I looked up. She said, "Can I help you with something?" I said, "I was checking the MISRA communications record." She said, "For the incident?" I said, "The July 29th entry isn't here." She said, "What do you mean?" I described what I'd found, or rather, hadn't found. She got up and came over and looked. She read through the same pages I had. She said, "That's an omission." I said, "Do you remember making the call on July 29th? She said, "I remember the second signal. Tom made the call. I was at the helm." I said, "Does Tom keep a separate log of communications?" She said, "The deck log would have it." I said, "The deck log doesn't have the July 29 operational period, as we discussed." She was quiet. She looked at the binder. She said, "I'll bring this up with the captain." I thanked her and left. I went back to the lab and sat at my workstation and looked at my notebook. 2 separate record systems, both with the same gap. The deck log omitted the July 29 transit and search operation. The MISR communications log omitted the July 29 call to MISR call. Both were paper records maintained by the same watch crew. Tom had made the MISR call. Sandra had been at the helm. Tom remembered going out to search. He'd told me so. Sandra's memory of the period was unclear. Neither record had the event in it. The GPS data did. The GPS data, which I managed, had the full record of the transit, but that was still there. I backed up the GPS export files to my personal laptop and to a small USB drive I kept in my bag. We arrived in Halifax on August 17th at 11:20 in the morning. The weather was excellent. The drive-in past McNabb's Island and up the harbor to Pier 35 took about 40 minutes at slow speed, and I stood on the bow deck for part of it, watching the city come back into view. Halifax from the water looks like a city that takes the harbor seriously, which it does. The buildings step up from the waterfront, and you can see the citadel on the hill from a long way off. It's a functional, unflashy view, and I'd come to feel something that wasn't quite affection for it, closer to relief. After 3.5 weeks at sea, solid ground has a quality that's hard to describe until you're about to feel it again. We docked, and over the next 6 hours the ship was unloaded and the science party dispersed. Equipment goes off first, then personal gear. Voss arranged transportation for the instrument cases. Felix was going to the airport in the afternoon. He had a flight to Frankfurt connecting through Toronto. Lena was driving to Dartmouth, where she'd been staying with a friend before the voyage. Paul stayed aboard to supervise the handover of the instrument systems to the ship's maintenance period. I carried my gear off the gangway and loaded it into my car, which I'd left in the pier parking area before departure. My apartment was still on Roby Street, the same one I'd had since the separation. I hadn't given it up. The math had been that I'd spend roughly half the year at sea, and the rent during those months wasn't unmanageable. I drove there, carried my bag up the stairs, opened the windows, and stood in the apartment for a minute, listening to the sounds of the street below. Traffic, a dog somewhere, music from the restaurant downstairs. I checked my personal email. The email I'd sent to myself from my phone on August 13th was there. It had arrived. I read it. It was exactly what I'd written. A careful, factual summary of all the observations from the voyage, dated and timed. I printed it at the library copy shop on Quinpool Road 2 days later and put it in a folder with the notebook pages. Over the next several days, I tried to figure out what, if anything, to do with what I had. I thought about filing a report with Misircone directly. We had already filed the initial reports during the voyage. I could file a supplementary report after the fact, noting the discrepancies I'd found in the ship's records and the historical parallel with the Dunmore, but a supplementary Misir report from a member of the science party, not the captain or the communications officer, would probably go into a queue somewhere and sit. I didn't know how to make it reach someone who would actually engage with it. I thought about contacting the TSB, the Transportation Safety Board. The TSB investigates marine incidents, but the TSB investigates accidents and incidents with physical evidence. An incomplete decklog and some coincident historical records were not exactly within their mandate. I thought about going to DFO directly. I had Shaughnessy's name from the email chain. R. Shaughnessy, DFO Science Branch. I didn't have a phone number or a direct email. I spent part of a day in late August searching for R. Shaughnessy at DFO online. I found a LinkedIn profile for someone named Ross Shaughnessy at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, described as a senior research scientist in oceanography. The profile was sparse, just the position and institution, no details, but it confirmed he was real and gave me something to try. I found a DFO contact directory online and submitted an information request through their general inquiry form, asking whether their oceanography research division had done any study of maritime distress beacon patterns in the Flemish Cap area and whether I could be directed to the appropriate contact. I submitted it on August 21st. I heard nothing for 10 days. Then I received an automated acknowledgement saying my inquiry was under review and I'd receive a response within 30 business days. I was not surprised by this, but I was frustrated. I went back to the cruise report in the meantime. Voss had sent the draft around for comment in the last days of August, and my supplementary remarks section was included. I read through what she'd done with it. She had kept the factual material about the APIRB events, the dates, the positions, the signal characteristics, the Mircea responses. She had included my description of the search operation on July 29th. She had cut the historical material entirely. Nothing about the TSB reports, nothing about the Dunmore, nothing about the Cast 14 field note, nothing about the parallel structure. In the covering email with the draft she wrote, "Owen, I've retained the observational record for the APIRB events in the supplementary remarks, as this is appropriate scientific documentation. The historical analysis you've included goes beyond what we can substantiate in a cruise report, and I'd recommend keeping it separate from the program record for now. I'd encourage you to continue developing that analysis independently if you think it warrants further attention." I stared at continue developing that analysis independently for a while. It was a polite way of saying, "This is yours, not mine, not the program's." I replied and asked her directly, had she reported the APIRB events to DFO in addition to the Mircea, as Shaughnessy had requested? She replied after a day and said, "Appropriate reporting was done," which was not an answer. I wrote to Paul. I asked him more specifically about the historical documents aboard the ship, the ones he'd mentioned during the transit, the collection that had come over with the vessel in 2003. I asked whether he knew more about their content or provenance. He replied, "I think I overstated what I knew about those documents. I don't have a clear picture of the collection or its origins. It's something you could ask Diane Foster about. She handles the institutional records." I wrote to Diane Foster. I introduced myself and explained I'd been doing background research on research programs in the Flemish Cap area and had come across references to the Dunmore and was curious about any archival materials AMSI might have. I kept it vague. Diane wrote back promptly. She said she was happy to help and that AMSI did have some archival material from the pre-AMSI research history of the area, including some documentation related to the Dunmore program, which had been deposited with AMSI by the universities that had operated the vessel. She said if I wanted to look at the material, I was welcome to come by the AMSI office. She said it with the cheerful efficiency of an administrator who is glad to have a clear and answerable request. I went to the AMSI office on September 3. The building was on Morris Street, a converted Victorian that AMSI shared with two other marine research organizations. Diane Foster was exactly what she'd sounded like on the phone: organized, friendly, completely matter-of-fact. She brought me into a small research room and showed me a banker's box labeled Dunmore D-Series Voyage Archive, D1 through D4 partial. I sat down with it and went through it carefully. The box contained a mix of materials. Some were administrative, permits, contracts between the universities and the vessel charter company, crew manifests. Some were scientific, partial field notebooks, 2 printed computer outputs from instrument data runs, a logbook of station work for voyages D1 through D3. Voyage D4 was represented by very little. There was a copy of the voyage plan, dated October 15, 1989. There was a crew manifest listing 11 people. There was a single page of handwritten station notes for the first cast of the voyage, Cast 1. Everything else from D4 was absent. Diane, when I mentioned this, said, "The D4 archive has always been incomplete. We received these materials from Laval University and from DFO after the incident. The investigation collected much of the documentation, and I don't believe all of it was returned." I said, "There should be CTD field notes going through Cast 13. They would have been in the Instrument Technical Manual, a Seabird CTD model from that period. Do you have any instrument manuals from the Dunmore?" She thought about it. She went and checked something. She came back and said, "I don't believe we have instrument manuals from the Dunmore here. We may have received some technical materials through DFO at various points, but anything like that would have gone into our general technical library rather than the archive box. I could look into it." I said, "The cast notes through Cast 13 were published, used in a 1992 oceanography paper, but Cast 14 was never recovered. Is there any documentation from DFO about what happened to the Cast 14 data?" She said, "I'm not aware of any, but I don't have full visibility into what DFO retained." I looked at the crew manifest from D4, 11 people, Captain H. Weller, Mate J. Reeves, Engineer R. Costa, Deckhands J. Pugh, K. Malone, D. Zabo, Chief Scientist, Dr. A. Farquhar, Laval, Research Associates, B. Elliott, Memorial, G. Maddox, Memorial, A. Curian, Laval, and a position listed as Marine Systems Technician, P. Santos. I photographed the manifest with my phone. I thanked Diane and left. On the bus back to my apartment, I thought about the manifest. 11 people, none of them had been recovered. The vessel had never been found, 30 years. I thought about Cast 14 and the note in the instrument manual, and the 406 MHz signal received around 0300 on November 7, 1989. The duty officer called Halifax. Halifax no record. Whoever the duty officer was that night, probably J. Reeves, the mate, or possibly P. Santos if the call was treated as a systems issue. They had called Halifax and been told there was no record. Then the Dunmore's last communication was the next day. Then she was gone. What had they found when they went to look? Or had they gone to look at all? The note said, "Duty officer called Halifax." It didn't say they altered course. And now, 30 years later, our ship had received the same signal, twice. We had altered course and found nothing. I kept thinking about the depth soundings I'd noted, 1,200 to 1,800 meters, at the estimated source location. The Flemish Cap rises to relatively shallow depths in some areas, but where we'd searched was deep water, deep enough that if something was down there, it would never be found by surface search. I'm going to stop myself there because I was getting into speculation that I can't support, and that's not the point. The point is what the record shows, not what I was imagining at 2 in the morning. I went back to my routine over the following weeks. I had follow-on work to do for the crew's data, documentation, archiving, responding to Voss's comments on the data quality reports. September is a month I generally like. Halifax in autumn has a quality I find easier than the summer, cooler and cleaner, the harbor light changing. I ran along the waterfront in the mornings. I slept normally. I kept waiting to hear back from DFO. On September 18th, I received a response to my inquiry. It was a form letter in both official languages, thanking me for contacting DFO and informing me that my inquiry had been forwarded to the appropriate division for response. It provided a case number. On September 24th, I received a second response. This one, a real email rather than a form letter. It was from a person named J. Auger in the DFO Communications Office, not from Shaughnessy or anyone in the science branch. It said, "Thank you for your inquiry regarding maritime beacon records in the Flemish Cap area. This information is maintained by the Canadian Coast Guard under MISR MC oversight. DFO does not maintain independent records of maritime distress signals. For inquiries about specific incidents, please contact MISR CC Halifax directly." I read this. Then I went back to the email chain Diane had found in the AMC archive, the one from R. Shaughnessy, asking Voss to report anomalous observations to DFO's office. If DFO didn't maintain records of maritime distress signals, why had their senior research scientist asked AMC to report anomalous observations to their office? I wrote back to J. Auger and asked specifically about R. Shaughnessy and the research program connection. I received no further response. In early October, I did something I'd been thinking about. I looked up the research paper Felix had mentioned, the 1992 Physical Oceanography study with a German co-author from Kiel, the one that had used Dunmore D4 data from casts 1 through 13 and included the footnote about the science team. It took me about 2 hours to find it because I was working from a vague description and didn't have a title or full author list. I finally located it through a German marine science database, a paper published in 1992 in a journal called Berichte zur Polarforschung, which was a German polar and marine research publication. The paper was about thermohaline circulation in the subpolar North Atlantic. One of the 3 authors was from the Leibniz Institute in Kiel. The paper was in German, with an abstract in English. I used an online translation tool for the body of the paper. The Dunmore data was referenced in a methods section, described as preliminary Flemish Cap observations collected in November 1989 that had been made available to the authors through the Canadian University Consortium. The footnote acknowledging the science team read, in translation, "The authors gratefully acknowledge the contribution of the Science Party of R.V. Dunmore, Voyage D4, November 1989. CTD data provided represents casts 1 to 13 of the planned program." This confirmed what Felix had told me, casts 1 to 13. But I found something else in the paper's references section. Buried in the list of cited works was this entry: Farquhar, A. 1989, unpublished. Preliminary benthic and water column observations from Flemish Cap Station Grid, RV, Dunmore Voyage, D4. Manuscript in preparation. An unpublished manuscript in preparation by A. Farquhar. Dr. A. Farquhar, the chief scientist aboard the Dunmore, who had been lost with the vessel. An unpublished manuscript cited in a 1992 paper from a work prepared in 1989 by someone who was dead. The citation was formatted the way citations to unpublished works in preparation are formatted, as if the work exists and is available to the citing authors, even if not publicly published. That means the 1992 authors had seen or been given a copy of Farquhar's preliminary manuscript. But Farquhar had died in November 1989, along with everyone else on the Dunmore. If the manuscript had been in preparation in 1989 and cited in 1992 as an unpublished but presumably existing document, someone had it. Either Farquhar had sent or shared a draft before the vessel was lost, or the manuscript had been recovered from some other source. I wrote to the Kiel Institute. I asked whether they had any records of the Farquhar manuscript or knew how their 1992 authors had accessed it. I received a polite response about 2 weeks later from an archivist saying they didn't have records of specific manuscript exchanges from that period, and that the corresponding author of the 1992 paper had since retired, but that they could try to pass my inquiry along. I never heard anything further about that. In November 2019, I went back to sea. The fall program was a shorter one, 12 days. A CTD transect in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for a different research group using the Peregrine under a separate contract. It was routine work, and I was glad to have it. The distance from shore tends to clarify things that shore living complicates, and I'd been living with the Flemish Cap material for 3 months, and it was starting to wear on me in a low-level way. I was not managing well. I will say that clearly. By late October, I was not sleeping well, and it wasn't the sinus issue. I was lying awake, thinking about things I couldn't resolve, which is worse than lying awake for no reason, because at least no reason insomnia doesn't give you anything to argue with. The Gulf of St. Lawrence voyage was pleasant and professionally successful, and largely uneventful. The company was a different science party, a group I didn't know well, and the change of people was good. I came back in late November with a clean data set and a somewhat better ability to sleep. By then, I'd had no further substantive response from DFO, no response from the Kiel Institute, and a brief but conclusive note from Voss saying the cruise report had been finalized and submitted to AMSI and the program funders. She wrote, "Your supplementary remarks were a useful addition to the record." I read, "useful addition to the record," and thought about what it would mean for a document to be useful versus acted upon. I let most of December pass without doing anything further. Christmas was quiet. I'd reached the point of acceptance with the divorce that doesn't feel like peace exactly, more like the settling of a debt. Everything accounted for, nothing outstanding, a certain blankness where the argument used to be. I called my mother in Truro. I went to a party at a colleague's apartment and stayed for an hour. I ran along the waterfront on the days when the wind was tolerable. In January 2020, I did 2 things that led to the last pieces of this. The first was a conversation with Kevin Oates, the chief engineer on the Peregrine. I'd seen Kevin in town in late December. Halifax is a small enough world that running into workmates ashore happens often enough, and we'd had a brief and pleasant conversation at a coffee shop that didn't lead anywhere in particular. But in early January he called me. He said he'd been thinking about something and wanted to ask me whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the vessel's electronics during the summer voyage. He said this unprompted. He hadn't heard me ask the same question of Danny. As far as I knew, he didn't know about my investigation at all. I said, "What makes you ask?" He said, "Some things about the electrical logs from July. We log power consumption by system. There was a draw from the GMDSS suite on the night of July 29 that was larger than baseline and also larger than the active VHF communications we logged for that period. I noticed it when I was reviewing the maintenance records before the fall program." He paused. "It's a small thing, could be a monitoring glitch, but it's been on my mind." I said, "What does an above baseline draw from the GMDSS suite suggest?" He said, "If all the logged activity was accounted for and the draw was still high, it could mean an unlisted device was drawing power or an unlisted communication event." I said, "An unlisted communication?" He said, "Maybe, or equipment fault. I'm not trying to say anything specific. It was a small anomaly in a routine record." I thanked him and said it was interesting. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a while. An above baseline power draw from the GMDSS suite on the night of July 29th, the night we received the second signal, the night with the 47-minute server log gap. If a communication event had occurred that wasn't in the Mismortsi communications log, it would still have drawn power. Power logs are maintained by the engineering department, not the bridge, and they're not cross-referenced to communications records as a matter of routine. An unlisted communication on that night would appear in Kevin's power logs, and not in Tom or Sandra's Misruk log. I wrote it down. Kevin called the anomaly small. It was small, but it was in a different record system from all the others, and it pointed at the same night. The second thing I did in January was try to find the beacon ID. I'd been limited during the voyage to the partial string I'd captured from the Gaminis terminal, but when we'd been in contact with Mr. Mirsi during the voyage, Mr. Mirsi would have received our full report of the signal, including the decoded ID string as captured by our system. That report was on file with Mr. C. I couldn't access it directly, but I could submit a formal request for a copy of the incident report, which is a matter of public record under Canadian maritime law. I filed a request with Mr. C. Halifax in early January 2020. I described myself as a crew member of the RV Peregrine present during the APIRB events of July 27 and July 29, 2019. I requested copies of the incident reports filed by the Peregrine for both events. The response came back in mid-February. It said, "Our records show one incident report filed by RV Peregrine for an anomalous 406 MHz signal detection on July 27, 2019. Position 47 degree 12 pinch, N44, degree 08 W. This report has been reviewed and no action was taken as no vessel was identified in distress. We have no record of a subsequent report on July 29, 2019. One report. 1, not 2. Our ship had called Mr. Airc twice. The bridge communications on the Peregrine, or at least the communications log as I'd seen it, which was incomplete in its own way, suggested 2 calls. Tom had confirmed making the second call, and Mr. C had 1 report on file. The power anomaly in Kevin's logs, the server heartbeat gap, the missing deck log entry, the missing Mr. communications log entry, and now the missing incident report at Mr. CC, all pointing at July 29, 2019. I made copies of the Mr. MC response letter and added it to my folder. I thought about this for several days. The consistent gap was July 29. Something about July 29 was not in the record. Multiple independent record systems were missing the same event. There are, as far as I can think, 3 general categories of explanation for multiple independent record gaps, all covering the same period. 1. Coincidence. Multiple separate failures and omissions that happen to fall on the same night. This is less likely the more independent the systems are, but not impossible. 2. A systemic failure that affected all records simultaneously. Something that happened on the night of July 29 that affected multiple systems at once. The server, the paper logs, the communication records, the MISRC files. For this to produce the same gap across all systems, the failure would need to have been specific to that time period and would need to have been undetected by everyone involved. This is possible in principle. I don't know what would cause it. 3. The records were deliberately modified. Multiple people, or one person with access to multiple systems, removed or altered records pertaining to July 29th. This requires both motive and capability, and I don't know who would have had both. I sat with the 3 categories and didn't know what to do with them. In March 2020, the pandemic started, and most research vessel operations were suspended. I was furloughed for 3 months, then came back for limited operations in the fall. The professional disruption put the Flemish Cap inquiry somewhat on the shelf, not because I'd resolved it, but because I was tired, and because there was nothing actionable I could identify that I hadn't already tried. I did one more thing in the fall of 2020. I located the retired German co-author from the 1992 Kiel paper. He was still in Germany, in his late 70s. His name was Dr. Heinrich Broch. I found him through an academic directory and wrote him a letter by hand, in English, which I've been told he reads, asking about the Farquhar manuscript citation. I asked how the 1992 authors had come to cite an unpublished manuscript by a scientist who died in November 1989. His response came by email about 3 weeks later. His English was very good. He wrote, "I remember the paper well. The Farquhar citation was provided to us by a third party whose name I am not comfortable sharing. We received a draft of the Farquhar manuscript in the fall of 1990 from this intermediary, who indicated it had been assembled from recovered materials. I do not know the provenance of these materials in detail. At the time, I was satisfied that the data in the manuscript was consistent with the deforestation plan and the cast data we had already received through the university consortium. The manuscript existed, and we cited it accurately. I will say one other thing because your letter raises it implicitly. The data from casts 1 through 13 was shared through normal academic channels. The cast 14 data was never shared. I asked the intermediary about cast 14 and was told that the materials from the final cast had not been recovered and that I should proceed with the data available. I found this strange at the time, but I had no reason to question it further. I hope this helps your research. I am not sure it answers your question." It did not answer my question. It opened another one. The Farquhar manuscript had been assembled from recovered materials and provided to the German researchers in fall 1990 by an intermediary who knew about the cast 14 data and said it hadn't been recovered. If the cast 14 data hadn't been recovered, the cast 14 instrument manual with the field note about the 406 MHz signal probably hadn't been recovered either, except that it had. It existed in OMSI's digital archive via DFO's technical library. How had it gotten there if the cast 14 materials weren't recovered? Or was the instrument manual a different thing from the cast 14 data? Did materials from the final cast mean the scientific data record specifically, while the instrument technical manual was a different kind of document that traveled a different path? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. There's one more thing, and then I'll tell you about the last signal. In January 2021, going through boxes from the move I'd made during the second pandemic lockdown, I'd finally left the Roby Street apartment for a smaller, cheaper place on Agricola Street, rearranging my finances again as the furlough dragged into irregular work. I found a printed page that I didn't immediately recognize. It was folded in quarters, tucked into the navigation almanac I'd carried aboard the Peregrine. I'd forgotten it was there. It was a page of text that I'd printed at some point during the voyage. The format was a ship's log entry, the kind of formal typewritten record that gets done on the bridge for archival purposes. The date at the top was November 8, 1989. The vessel name at the top was R.V. Dunmore. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the boxes and read it. The entry covered the period from midnight to 0600 on November 8th. It recorded the watch officers, weather conditions, engine status, vessel position at 0000 and 0600. The 0600 position was in the Flemish Cap, on the Dunmore's survey grid, and a series of brief operational notes. The final note read, 0315, Chief Scientist Farquhar reports instrument malfunction, cast postponed. 0430, repeat communication with Halifax, signal detected, 0300 previous. Halifax confirms no record received, no active incident. Chief Scientist requests signal be logged for inclusion in research record, logged as requested. This was the log entry corresponding to the field note I'd found in the instrument manual. But the ship's log from November 8 should have been at DFO. It should have been collected as part of the incident investigation. If it was collected, it should be in the TSB investigation file, which would be a matter of public record if you knew to ask for it. I had no memory of printing this. I do not print things without a reason. During the voyage, I'd printed the TSB report, the Miss Merksea communications records, and the instrument manual page. Those I remembered. I didn't remember printing a Dunmore decklog page. But it was printed on the same paper as the other documents, the ship's lab inkjet paper, which has a slightly thicker texture than normal office paper. I knew the paper. I'd used it every day for months. How it had gotten into the almanac, I couldn't say. The almanac had been on the bookshelf in my cabin throughout the voyage, and the first notebook, which I'd also kept in the almanac, was also there. I'd put the other printed documents in the notebooks. I would have put this one there too, if I'd known I had it, but I hadn't known I had it. I looked at the sheet for a long time. The text looked right. The format was consistent with period maritime logs I'd seen in the archives. The language was appropriate. The technical content made sense. It didn't read like something fabricated. It read like a routine decklog entry that happened to document something unusual. Halifax confirms no record received, no active incident. Chief Scientist requests signal be logged for inclusion in research record. Farquhar had wanted the signal in the record. He'd asked for it to be logged specifically. He'd known, apparently, that the kind of anomaly they were observing was the kind that needed documentation. A day after this log entry, the Dunmore sent her last weather report. After that, nothing. I thought about the intermediary who had assembled the Farquhar manuscript from recovered materials and delivered it to the German researchers in 1990. An intermediary who knew about Cast 14 and said its materials hadn't been recovered. An intermediary who apparently had access to something from the Dunmore's final days. I thought about DFO asking Voss to report anomalous observations for programs in that area. A standard request for programs in this area. How many programs had worked in that area over 30 years? How many had received the same request? How many had received the signal? I put the Dunmore decklog page in the folder with the other documents. That folder is on my desk right now. It's not thick. It doesn't look like much. A few printed pages, some photocopied notebook pages, 2 Miss Merksea response letters, the Brock email printed out, and the GPS export data on a USB drive. When I look at it, I think about how small the actual evidence is compared to the shape of what I think it implies. Which brings me to the last signal. This was April 2021. I was back working a full season by then, the pandemic restrictions having eased enough for limited research operations to resume. We were doing an early spring survey in the Northwest Atlantic, not the Flemish Cap area. We were working farther north, on the Labrador Shelf, as part of a different program. The Peregrine had the same core crew: Moreau, Tom, Sandra, Kevin, Danny. The science party was different. Voss wasn't on this one. Paul was aboard. We were about 8 days into the program. April 17th, 2021. We were at approximately 53 AA degree 20-N, 53 AA degree 45 W, which is the northeastern Labrador Shelf, well north of the Flemish Cap. The date is important, so is the position. I was on watch in the main lab at around 0:10 when the GMDSS terminal registered a 406 MHz signal. I looked at it for a moment. My first response was a cold, specific feeling in my chest that was not quite dread and not quite recognition, something between them. The signal was strong, stronger than either of the 2019 signals. The ID string the system decoded was 406044. The country code was 232, UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. The vessel-specific digits were more readable than before. 8 of them came through clearly. I'd had 5 to 6 in 2019. These 8 characters, combined with the country code prefix, were enough that I might be able to run them against the International EPIRB registry directly, if I could get access to it. I wrote down the string immediately. Then I looked at the signal characteristics and the bearing. The bearing from our current position was approximately south-southwest. I traced it out on the chart. We were on the Labrador Shelf, 53 AFE, 20 butts 20N. The bearing pointed roughly toward the Flemish Cap area, roughly 350 nautical miles. A 406 MHz EPIRB signal has a nominal transmission power of 5 watts and a frequency of 406.028 MHz. At 5 watts, even in ideal propagation conditions, the usable signal range via direct RF propagation is maybe 10 to 20 nautical miles. 350 nautical miles was not within the range of direct propagation. Satellite capture was possible at that distance. The COSPA-SARSAT satellites at medium Earth orbit altitude can receive signals from anywhere on the surface, but a satellite-captured signal would have been forwarded to Misr Airmirci, not received directly by us. Our GMDSS terminal was a direct receiver, not a satellite relay. We should not have been able to directly receive this signal. I called the bridge. Tom was on watch. He said they hadn't picked it up on the bridge terminal. I described what I was seeing on the lab terminal. He came down to the lab and looked at the log. He said, "That's at 406. I said, "Yes." He said, "From what bearing?" I showed him the chart. He stood very still for a moment. He said, "That's too far for direct reception." I said, "I know." He said, "I'll call Miss Merksey." I said, "Tom, does this remind you of anything?" He looked at me. He had the look of someone who wants to say something and is deciding whether to say it. Then he said, "Yes." He said it simply, not as an admission of something, but as a plain fact. I said, "Do you know what's producing these signals?" He said, "No." I said, "Does Moreau?" He said, "I don't know what Moreau knows." He went back to the bridge to call Misr Rici. I sat at the terminal and watched the signal log. The signal had been received at 0118. At 047, it was still showing as the last entry, no new signal received. Misr Rici, when Tom reached them, had no satellite alert on file. Same as 2019. Moreau did not alter course this time. He kept us on survey track. I don't know whether this was because the range made a physical search clearly pointless, or because of some other reason. I didn't ask. I wrote everything down. In the morning, I tried to do something I hadn't been able to do from the ship in 2019 due to connection limitations. The satellite internet on the Peregrine had been upgraded over the winter to a faster system. I had enough bandwidth to access the COSPA-SARSAT public beacon registration system directly. The public system doesn't give you the full international registry, That requires law enforcement or maritime authority access, but it gives you a public search interface where you can check whether a given beacon ID is registered and get the country of registration confirmed. I entered the partial string I had, with wildcard characters for the digits I wasn't certain about. The search returned 3 possible matches. The first was registered to a vessel currently in service out of Aberdeen, Scotland. The second was registered to a vessel currently in service out of Cork, Ireland. The third was listed as registration cancelled, vessel status, lost at sea, date of loss, November 1989. I stared at the third result for a long time. The entry for the third result showed beacon ID, country, United Kingdom, MID 232, vessel name, vessel type, registration cancelled, December 1989, reason for cancellation, vessel lost at sea, date of loss, November 1989. The vessel name and type were redacted. In the public interface, personal and sensitive details about lost vessels can be masked. This is supposed to protect family information and legal records related to incident investigations. I took a screenshot. I wrote down the full beacon ID as the system had filled in the ambiguous characters. I wrote down the exact wording of the cancellation entry. Then I sent a formal inquiry to MSRC Halifax and to the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, asking for the full registration details for that specific beacon ID. MSRC Halifax responded 2 weeks later. They said, "We have located the record you requested. The beacon in question is registered to a vessel that was reported as lost at sea in November 1989. The vessel registration has been inactive since that date. We are not able to share further details of the record without a formal information request under the Access to Information Act. We are forwarding your inquiry to MSRC St. John's and to the TSB for their awareness." The UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency responded 3 weeks later. They said, "The beacon ID you have provided is registered to a vessel in the MCA database. This registration was cancelled in 1989. Details of the vessel are withheld under the provisions of Maritime Incident Record Confidentiality. We have no current distress alert on file for this ID, and no active incident response has been triggered." 2 separate maritime authorities. Both confirmed the beacon was real. Both confirmed it was registered to a vessel lost in November 1989. Both declined to confirm the vessel name. November 1989. Flemish Cap Area. UK registered vessel. I think you see what I'm saying. I'm not going to say the name definitively because I can't prove it. All I can say is that the pattern of what I know points in one direction, and I don't know what to do with that direction. I don't know what it would mean for a vessel lost in 1989 to be producing a valid EPIRB signal in 2019 and 2021. The physical explanations I've been able to think of don't work. Batteries, corrosion, depth pressure. None of it allows for a device that functions across 30 years on the ocean floor. But I also can't say the physical explanation is impossible from where I'm standing, because I don't have the vessel. I don't have the beacon. I have a decoded ID string and 2 bureaucratic confirmations that circle around a name they won't put in writing. After the Yucca Mecca response, I spent about a week in a particular mental state that I'm going to try to describe accurately. It wasn't fear. I'd stopped feeling afraid of this in the abstract sense sometime in 2020, partly through exhaustion and partly through the kind of desensitization that comes from carrying the same unanswerable question for long enough that it stops producing adrenaline and becomes something more like a weather condition you're used to. What I felt was a very specific discomfort that comes from the gap between what the evidence points toward and what I can allow myself to conclude. I've spent my career in evidence. Data points toward conclusions, and you either accept the conclusions the data supports, or you reject them and find different data. The conclusions here were ones I didn't have a framework for accepting, which left me, professionally and personally, in a position I didn't know how to stand in. I talked to Paul about it, not exhaustively, but enough. We were in Halifax between programs in early May 2021, and I went to the AMC office to pick up some instrument calibration paperwork, and Paul was there. We had coffee in the break room. I told him what I'd found from the beacon registry. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" I said I didn't know. He said, "The TSB knows about it now. Miss Rixey forwarded your inquiry." I said, "Yes, but they won't investigate a 30-year-old incident based on a beacon ID inquiry from a data tech." He said, "No, probably not." I said, "Paul, do you think there's something physically explainable happening here?" He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. He put his coffee down. He said, "I think there are things we know about ocean acoustics and electromagnetic propagation that might account for some of what you've observed. I think it's possible to receive signals from more distant sources than the nominal range under specific conditions, particularly at certain depths and water mass boundaries in this area of the North Atlantic. It doesn't explain why the signal matches a 1989 registration." He said, "No, it doesn't." I said, "Does any of this surprise you?" He said, "Yes and no." He didn't elaborate. I didn't push. We finished our coffee, and I picked up the paperwork and left. Yes and no. I've thought about those words many times. In a person as precise as Paul, yes and no doesn't mean he couldn't make up his mind. It means both things were true simultaneously. Something about the situation was surprising, and something about it wasn't. What wasn't surprising to him? That signals appeared in the Flemish Cap area from unidentifiable sources? That a registration from November 1989 was associated with those signals? That bureaucratic records were inconsistent in ways that clustered around July 29, 2019? I don't know. I went back to sea in June 2021 for a standard summer program, not the Flemish Cap. We were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence again, a different chief scientist, new graduate students, the normal rhythms. I did my job well and filed good data and came home in July. In August 2021, DFO's science branch responded to my original inquiry from September 2019. Almost 2 years later, the response was from someone named Elaine Corbett, described as a research liaison in the Atlantic Science Division. She wrote, "Thank you for your patience with our response time. Your inquiry has been reviewed by our Oceanography Research Division. We are aware of the historical research context in the Flemish Cap area, including the loss of the RV Dunmore in November 1989. We maintain ongoing interest in oceanographic programs conducted in that area as part of our long-term monitoring mandate. Regarding the anomalous radio beacon events you described from the summer 2019 program, these have been noted in our records. We are not in a position at this time to provide further information about the interpretation of these events or the status of any related investigation. We would encourage you to direct future inquiries through your institution, AMC, rather than directly to this office. If you believe you have documentation of physical evidence related to these events, we would ask that you retain that documentation and not discard it." Read that last paragraph again. We would ask that you retain that documentation and not discard it. Not, "Thank you for your inquiry." Not, "We have no further information." They ask me to retain the documentation. Why would they ask me to retain documentation for an event they claimed they weren't in a position to discuss? Either they were telling me they had interest in it and couldn't explain why, or someone had written that paragraph out of an institutional habit of covering their bases, or there was a third option I wasn't seeing. I wrote to Elaine Corbett directly and asked what specific documentation she was referring to. and whether DFO intended to follow up with me. I received no response to that email. I printed the Corbett email and added it to the folder. That was the most recent substantive development. I'm writing this in the summer of 2022, 3 years after the summer voyage, 2.5 years after I started the investigation in earnest. I still have the folder. I still have the GPS data on the USB drive. I still have the notebooks. I thought about filing an access to information request with DFO and MSRC for the full records related to the 1989 Dunmore incident and the 2019 Peregrine EPIRB events. I may still do that. The process is slow, and the results are often heavily redacted, and I'm not sure what I'd learn that I don't already know in outline. I've thought about talking to the families of the Dunmore crew and science team. I looked some of them up. It's 33 years. Most of the immediate family members of the people who died would be in their 60s and 70s now, if they're alive. I don't know what I would say to them. I have some circumstantial evidence that their family member may have received an anomalous radio signal the night before the vessel was lost. I have no explanation for it, no conclusion, nothing that resolves into an answer. I'm not going to contact them with that. I think what I'm most uncertain about is the simplest question: what was the signal? Not the EPIRB signal in the technical sense, I understand that. I mean, what was it communicating? An EPIRB's function is to say, here I am in distress, come find me. That's all it does. It transmits position and identification. It says, a vessel registered to this flag with this ID is here and needs help. If the signal we received was from the Dunmore's beacon, and I'm not saying it was, I'm saying that's what the ID points toward, then it was saying, a vessel registered as lost in 1989 is here, at these coordinates, now, which is impossible. I've spent 3 years and some amount of my savings and a lot of my sleep trying to find a pathway to possible. I haven't found one. The physical arguments don't hold. The battery argument doesn't hold. The depth and pressure argument doesn't hold. And yet the signal was there, recorded on the ship's system, received by a functioning instrument, logged with a time and bearing, and received not just in 2019, but again in 2021, from an even greater distance, by the same vessel in a different area, and received in 1989 by the Dunmore herself, the night before she was lost, from a source that also had no satellite record, that also produced no physical evidence, that also was filed away as a maritime radio anomaly and left to sit. I've thought about whether the 1989 signal and the 2019 and 2021 signals were the same event from different directions. Not in the sense that makes any sense. I mean in the sense that if you're trying to find a logical framework, and the framework has to include something that doesn't follow the normal rules, you need to know what rules you're actually dealing with. The things I'm certain of: the signals were received. The instrument records them. This is verifiable. The beacon ID points to a UK-registered vessel lost in November 1989 in the Flemish Cap area. 2 maritime authorities have confirmed this in writing without naming the vessel. The records of events on July 29, 2019 are inconsistent across multiple independent systems. Something about that night is differently represented in different records. DFO has active interest in events in the Flemish Cap area and asked me to retain my documentation. A field note from the Dunmore's last research cast describes receiving a 406 MHz signal the night before the vessel's last contact. This note was not included in the TSB investigation record I've been able to access. The 1992 paper cites a manuscript assembled from recovered Dunmore materials, but the materials from the final cast were not shared with the citing authors. The manual that contains the field note describing the signal ended up in AMSI's archive via DFO's technical library. The things I can't account for. how the printed Dunmore declog page ended up in my personal almanac, what the power draw anomaly on July 29 represented, why DFO asked programs in the Flemish Cap area to report anomalous observations, what the signals physically are or were, what happened on the night of July 29 between 22:31 and 23:18. I'm going to stop here because I've been writing this for several weeks and I'm not sure that writing more is going to do anything useful. The folder is on my desk, the USB is in the drawer, the notebooks are on the shelf. I'm going back to sea next month, a fall program in the Northwest Atlantic, not the Flemish Cap, or at least not the Flemish Cap by plan. Survey tracks change, weather changes. Vessels get sent to positions they weren't scheduled for. If we end up in the Flemish Cap area, I'll have my notebook with me. I'll be watching the GMDS terminal. I've been watching it every night since July 2019. Not anxiously, or at least I tell myself it isn't anxiety. It's more like the attention you develop after you've worked in data long enough that you know a gap in a record when you see one. A gap means something happened. The question is only what. The terminal is usually quiet. Most nights, there's nothing but weather broadcasts and navigation warnings and the ordinary automated traffic of the sea.